Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Fairy on the farm in Ohio. The farm sat in the heart of Ohio, miles away from the nearest town, a quiet stretch of land where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly above rolling fields and overgrown fences. The house, an old two-story farmhouse with creaking wood and peeling paint, had been in Emma's family for generations. It wasn't much, but it was home. From the front porch, Emma could see the entire expanse of the farm, with its barns, worn down by years of neglect, and the fields that stretched out like an ocean of green and brown. It was the kind of place where you could hear your own thoughts, interrupted only by the occasional bird call or the distant rustling of leaves. The isolation had its perks. Emma liked it here. It was peaceful. There were no distractions, no bustling crowds or constant noise. It was just her parents, and her younger brother Timmy. They lived simply, tending to the animals and crops. The days were long and quiet, marked by the rising sun and the fading light of dusk. But there was something about this place that always made Emma feel as though she wasn't truly alone. She couldn't put her finger on it. Sometimes, the air would feel a little too still, and the shadows too long, even in the middle of the afternoon. But that was just how things were. Life on the farm had its oddities, sure, but it was hers. She'd grown used to it. But tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge in the evening sky, something felt different. There was a heavy stillness in the air, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The wind had stopped. The usual hum of the insects, the distant croak of frogs, and the rustling of tree branches had all fallen silent. Emma sat on the porch, her legs hanging off the side, staring out at the fields. It was strange. In all her years of living on the farm, she had never experienced such an eerie quiet before. Then, she saw it. A faint glimmer of light appeared at the edge of the woods. At first, she thought it was just the last bit of sunlight reflecting off something in the distance. But as she stared harder, she realized that it wasn't the sunset. The glow seemed to shift, moving between the trees in a fluid, almost unnatural way. It was a pale, shimmering light, as though a star had descended into the forest itself. Emma rubbed her eyes, convinced that the setting sun was playing tricks on her. She had been sitting in the same spot for a while, and maybe the quiet was just getting to her. But when she looked again, the light was still there, moving. It was a figure. A small, faint shape, almost too delicate to be real. It looked like it was floating, its form outlined by the strange glow. Emma blinked again, but it didn't disappear. It was still there, moving slowly between the trees, as though beckoning her to follow. She felt a sudden jolt of unease. It wasn't that she believed in ghosts or myths, but there was something about the figure that made her skin prickle. Something about the way it seemed to call to her, not with sound but with a presence, pulling her attention toward it. The more she stared, the more hypnotic it became, like a siren's call. Just as the strange figure seemed to fade into the shadows of the woods, Emma heard a faint voice from behind her. "Emma, what are you looking at?" It was Timmy. He had come out of the house, his small face bright with curiosity. Emma hesitated, unsure of what to say. She could still see the figure out of the corner of her eye, flickering just beyond the tree line. "I thought I saw something," she murmured, standing up. "Probably nothing." Timmy squinted, looking in the direction Emma had been staring. "What? Where?" But the figure was gone. "Never mind," Emma said quickly, turning away from the trees. "Maybe it was just the light." Timmy didn't look convinced. "You sure?" "It looked like there was something moving." Emma nodded, a strange feeling settling in her chest. "Yeah, just the wind or something." But she knew it wasn't the wind. And as she glanced once more toward the darkening woods, she had a sinking feeling that the strange figure wasn't the last of it. As Emma sat quietly on the porch, the last of the evening sunlight began to slip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was cool now, the scent of fresh earth mixing with the faint scent of hay. It was a moment of peace, one Emma cherished after a long day of farm work. But as she sat there, staring out at the horizon, something caught her eye. At first, it was so faint that she thought it was a trick of the light. A shimmering glow, barely visible, just at the edge of the woods. Emma blinked, squinting into the growing twilight. She'd lived here all her life, and the woods were always there, just beyond the fence line, dark and quiet. But this was different. The light was too bright, too soft, to belong to the fading light of day. It wasn't the moon, nor a flash of starlight. It was something else, something unusual, something unnatural. At first, Emma thought it might be a reflection, maybe a firefly dancing too close to the ground. But no, this glow didn't flicker like the insects did. It was steady, almost as if it had its own rhythm. The glow seemed to pulse, faintly at first, and then it moved. A small figure. A shimmer of light, flickering like a dying flame but staying just out of full sight. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She rubbed her eyes, telling herself it was just the evening sun playing tricks. She was tired, perhaps overworked. Her mind was already on the chores for tomorrow. But as she looked back toward the spot, the figure was still there, moving in slow, deliberate motions just inside the edge of the trees. It wasn't an animal, or at least, it didn't look like one. Emma took a sharp breath, forcing herself to think rationally. It was probably a trick of the light, some natural phenomenon she hadn't noticed before. Perhaps a glint of moonlight or some distant reflection from a forgotten lantern. The woods were full of strange shadows, especially at night. The wind could make the trees move in ways that cast odd, fleeting shapes. She stood up from the porch, willing her legs to move, shaking off the unease creeping up her spine. There had to be a reasonable explanation for this. But as she moved toward the door, her gaze lingered for one last moment at the spot in the woods. The figure seemed to flicker again, this time unmistakably shaped like a person, though its form was still translucent and faint. It hovered just beyond the trees, its edges glowing softly in the twilight. The faintest sensation of movement, as if the figure was beckoning, tugged at Emma's chest. "No," she muttered to herself, feeling a chill creep over her. "It's just the light." She turned back to the door, willing herself to stop looking. Timmy would be coming out any minute, and she didn't want him to get any ideas. She had to stay grounded, stay focused. The figure would disappear with the last light of the day, just like all strange things did. Yet as Emma stepped inside, a lingering feeling remained, gnawing in her stomach. Something about that glowing figure, the way it moved, so deliberately, so purposefully, didn't sit right. And though she tried to push the thought from her mind, it stayed there, a whisper in the back of her head, warning her that perhaps the light wasn't the only thing that was playing tricks. That night, after dinner, Emma and Timmy sat together at the kitchen table, cleaning up the remnants of their meal. Their parents were still outside, finishing up the last chores of the day, the sound of the barn doors creaking and the faint clinking of tools drifting in through the open window. Timmy, ever the curious one, couldn't sit still for long, his small legs swinging under his chair as he spoke between bites. "I saw it again, Emma," he said, his voice low but excited. Emma paused mid-swipe of the dish towel, glancing at her younger brother. "What are you talking about?" Timmy leaned forward, his wide eyes gleaming in the dim light of the kitchen. "The light in the woods. I saw it just now. I swear. It was moving, like a person, but glowing, you know? Like a firefly, but bigger." Emma frowned slightly, wiping her hands dry. She had hoped that the strange sighting earlier was just a figment of her imagination, a trick of the light. The last thing she needed was Timmy getting worked up about something like this. "You're sure you saw something?" Emma asked, her voice careful. "Maybe it was just the moonlight. Or a bird." No, I saw it, Emma. It was a person. But not a person, you know?" Timmy's eyes were wide now, his words tumbling out faster. "It was glowing, like it was floating, and it moved, like it was walking but not touching the ground. It was right near the trees." Emma's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the trees. The same woods that had felt so still earlier, the same woods where she'd seen the faint figure. Could it have been the same thing? Timmy continued, his voice bubbling with excitement. "I tried to follow it, but when I got close, it disappeared. Like it was never even there. But it felt real, Emma. It felt like it was calling me. I swear it was, like it wanted me to follow it." Emma bit her lip, her thoughts swirling. "Timmy, that's just your imagination. The woods play tricks, especially at night. You know how the trees can look like shadows and things when the wind blows. But this wasn't a shadow." Timmy protested, his eyes shining with something that was both excitement and fear. "It was glowing. And it wasn't the wind, Emma. It was something else." Emma tried to suppress the shiver that ran down her spine. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to entertain the thought that the strange figure she'd seen might not have been her imagination, but what Timmy was describing sounded eerily familiar. The light, the movement, the sense of something otherworldly in the woods, it was all too much like what she had witnessed earlier. "You didn't go too far, did you?" Emma asked, her voice sharp now, concern creeping in. "You need to stay away from those woods, Timmy. You don't know what's out there." Timmy looked down at his feet, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I didn't go far. I promise. But I felt like it was calling to me. Like it wanted me to come closer." Emma's heart sank. She knew how easily Timmy's imagination could get carried away, but there was something in his voice now, something that made her wonder if he wasn't entirely mistaken. She had felt that pull earlier too, the strange compulsion to follow the light, to see where it led. "You need to be careful," Emma said quietly, her voice softening as she placed a hand on his arm. "The woods are not a place to play, especially after dark." Timmy nodded, though his excitement hadn't dimmed. "I'll be careful, Emma. I just wish you'd come with me next time. Maybe we can both see it together." Emma forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe," she said, though deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to get any closer to whatever it was that was hiding in those woods. The last thing she wanted was to lead her brother further into whatever was out there, lurking in the shadows. But the more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. The figure in the woods hadn't been an accident or a trick of the light. Timmy wasn't imagining things. Something was out there. Something strange. And it had been watching them both. That night, after they finished cleaning up, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The calm of the farm, so familiar and comforting during the day, now felt off, as if the night was stretching longer than it should. The idea of a glowing figure in the woods lingered in her thoughts, and Timmy's excitement only made her more restless. Timmy, after all, was insistent. He had a way of wearing down Emma's resolve, and as the night wore on, his eagerness to explore the woods seemed to grow stronger. Emma couldn't dismiss the worry in his voice when he talked about seeing the figure again. She knew her little brother, knew how easily his imagination could run wild, but something about the way he spoke felt different this time. It wasn't just excitement, it was as if he genuinely believed there was something out there. "Please, Emma," Timmy begged, standing at the doorway, looking out toward the darkened trees. "You saw it too, didn't you? The glowing thing. What if it's something special? We should check it out together. I'm not going alone." Emma hesitated, her eyes drifting back to the same spot on the horizon where she had seen the faint, shimmering light. The pull to the woods was undeniable. It was as though the trees were calling to her, whispering just below her consciousness. She pushed the thought away. No, she couldn't let her curiosity get the best of her, not with Timmy involved. But Timmy, his small face lit up by the soft glow of the kitchen light, wasn't going to back down. "You always say I should be brave. This time, we can both be brave, right? It's not like we're going far. Just a little way into the woods. You can see for yourself it's nothing, and we'll come back before Mom and Dad even know we're gone." Emma looked at him, her younger brother's wide, innocent eyes pulling at something deep inside her. She didn't want to seem like she was afraid, not in front of Timmy. She couldn't let him go alone, not even though every instinct in her screamed to keep away from the woods. The air felt thicker now, heavier, and the moonlight seemed to spill from the sky in eerie silvery streams, just bright enough to make the trees look like looming shadows. Taking a deep breath, Emma finally sighed. "All right," she muttered reluctantly. "We'll go, but only for a little while, okay? Just to the edge of the woods, and then we come back." "I'm serious, Timmy." Timmy grinned, his excitement contagious, though it only made Emma's anxiety grow. "I knew you'd come around," he said, already grabbing his jacket and hurrying toward the door. Emma followed him outside, the cool night air biting at her skin. She could hear the soft rustle of the wind stirring the trees, and the sounds of the farm, distant animals, the creak of the barn doors closing, seemed to fade behind them as they walked toward the edge of the field. The trees stood at the farthest reach of their farm, dark and still. A line of tall oaks and maples, their branches heavy with leaves, seemed to stretch toward the night sky. Beyond them was the forest, the land that Emma's family had never dared to explore fully. It was just too quiet, too full of secrets. Yet tonight, with Timmy leading the way, Emma felt herself drawn toward the line of trees, each step pulling her further into the dark unknown. As they reached the edge of the woods, the air felt colder, the sounds of the farm vanishing completely. There was only the faint rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant call of a night bird. Emma looked at Timmy, who was already peering into the darkness, his face intent with curiosity. "You sure this is a good idea?" Emma asked, her voice low. Timmy didn't respond right away, his eyes scanning the woods ahead. "I can see it again," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's just there, like before, I can feel it." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she squinted into the trees, trying to see what Timmy was so convinced was there. But the darkness swallowed everything, leaving nothing but the occasional rustle of the wind. She could feel it now, the pull, like an invisible force urging her forward. She shook her head, trying to push the feeling down. It was just the night playing tricks on her, right? Nothing more. But Timmy was already a few steps ahead of her, walking confidently toward the woods. "Come on, Emma. I know it's here. You'll see. You'll feel it too." Emma hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back, to go inside and forget about the strange lights. But Timmy's voice, full of wonder and excitement, made her feet move despite herself. She followed him deeper, the branches of the trees bending over them, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the stars. The further they went, the more the world around them seemed to quiet. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Emma's heart beat faster, and she could almost swear the ground beneath her feet felt different, as if the earth itself was shifting. But Timmy was ahead of her, and Emma couldn't bring herself to let him go alone. Then, suddenly, Timmy stopped. "I see it," he exclaimed, his voice barely above a whisper, but urgent. He pointed toward the farthest edge of the woods, where the trees parted slightly to reveal a clearing. And there, just beyond the trees, was a faint, glowing light. It flickered, almost like a distant lantern, casting a soft glow across the clearing. Emma's chest tightened. There it was again, the same strange light she had seen earlier. She felt it in her bones now, the pull that Timmy had described, stronger than before, as though something in the woods was beckoning her. She took a cautious step forward, the unease inside her growing with every inch. But Timmy was already moving toward it, drawn in by whatever it was that called to him. "Timmy!" Emma hissed, but it was too late. He was already walking toward the light, his small form disappearing into the darkness. Emma's heart raced as she stepped into the clearing, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Timmy was a few paces ahead, his small form framed by the pale light that seemed to pulse gently, as though the air itself was alive. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It was unmistakable now, not a trick of the light or a figment of her imagination. A soft, ethereal glow surrounded the figure, outlining a slender silhouette that seemed to shimmer in the night. As Emma's eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer, a being unlike anything she had ever seen. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and its features were delicate, almost too perfect, as though sculpted from moonlight itself. Its skin, a pale luminescent shade, seemed to ripple with an otherworldly energy, its long, flowing hair shimmering with a silvery sheen that moved as if stirred by an unseen wind. But it was the wings that left Emma frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The wings, delicate and gossamer, glowed with an intense light, flickering like the softest flame, their edges trailing wisps of light into the air. They were unlike anything Emma could describe, too beautiful, too fragile, and yet powerful in their quiet presence. They moved with an eerie grace, stirring the air around them as if they existed in a space beyond her understanding. For a moment, Emma stood motionless, her mind racing to comprehend what she was seeing. She wanted to run, to drag Timmy back to the safety of the house, but her legs refused to obey. It was as if the figure's presence had anchored her in place, rooted her to the spot. The world around her seemed to blur as her focus locked on the glowing creature in front of her. Timmy, however, was not frozen in fear. The excitement on his face had turned into something else, something more intense. His eyes were wide, his gaze fixed on the figure, as though he could see nothing else. Emma could hear his soft, odd voice, barely a whisper, as he spoke. "It's real, Emma," Timmy breathed, his words filled with wonder. I told you it was real." The figure's eyes, glowing faintly like the rest of it, seemed to shift toward Timmy. For a moment, the air felt thick with silence, as though the world had paused, holding its breath. Emma's pulse quickened. There was something in the figure's gaze, something that felt unnervingly aware, something that made her skin prickle. Timmy took a step forward, his feet moving almost involuntarily, as though drawn by an invisible force. His small hand stretched out toward the figure, as if reaching for something that only he could understand. His face was serene, his mouth parted slightly as though he were in a trance. "Timmy, don't." Emma finally found her voice, though it was shaky, weak. She tried to move toward him, but the moment she did, her feet felt like they were stuck in the earth. The ground beneath her was too solid, too heavy, and every step felt like a struggle against an unseen weight. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her hands trembled at her sides. But Timmy was already moving closer to the figure, completely entranced. His steps were slow but sure, as though he didn't even notice the danger. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and her throat tightened as she called out to him again. "Timmy, stop. You don't know what this is. Please, come back." But Timmy didn't listen. He was getting closer to the figure now, his body bending slightly as if to kneel before it. The light around the figure seemed to intensify, swirling like mist, as though the very air was alive with energy. Emma could feel the chill creeping down her spine, her instincts screaming at her to run, to pull Timmy away, to get as far from this thing as possible. But her body wouldn't move, her limbs too heavy, too numb with fear. The figure, now fully illuminated in the clearing, seemed to stand taller than before, its wings flaring slightly as if they were about to take flight. There was a sound, a low hum, like the whisper of the wind, but with a strange melodic undertone. Emma's heart thudded louder, each beat an echo in the silence that hung thick in the air. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world holding its breath as the figure and Timmy stood facing each other, a quiet tension building. Emma's voice trembled as she tried to reach out, but her hands were useless, clutched by the terror that gripped her chest. And then, as if sensing Emma's presence, the figure's eyes shifted toward her. There was a moment of stillness, a flicker of awareness, and Emma's stomach churned with a terrible realization. It wasn't just observing them, it was aware of them. Of her. Timmy, still entranced, took another step forward, closer to the figure, but Emma could see now the subtle shift in the figure's posture. It was as though it had decided. It wasn't calling to Timmy alone anymore. It was calling to her too. A whisper, soft and melodic, seemed to brush against her mind. It wasn't words, just a feeling, an invitation. A pull, gentle yet undeniable. "Come," it seemed to say, the thought invading her mind. "Come closer." Her breath hitched, her body trembling with fear, but still, she couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to save Timmy, to run back to the safety of the house. Yet the figure's presence was suffocating, and she felt her body weakening against it, as if it was pulling at something deep inside her. Timmy was nearly there, and Emma's stomach twisted into knots. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, she knew it wasn't good. It wasn't safe. But she couldn't stop him. And she couldn't stop herself from feeling that terrible pull. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the heavier the air became. The trees, once comforting with their familiar presence, now seemed to loom over them, their twisted branches reaching like dark fingers into the sky. Emma's feet crunched lightly against the carpet of fallen leaves, but every other sound seemed muted, as though the world had gone still. The usual hum of insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, everything had stopped. Only the soft, steady rustle of the wind in the treetops remained, and even that felt unnatural, too slow, too deliberate. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching her, their gnarled trunks like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and swaying in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. The shadows between the trees felt deeper now, darker, as if something was hiding just out of sight. Timmy, a few paces ahead, was completely oblivious to the tension that gripped Emma. He walked with a strange, almost unnatural calm, his steps light and steady. His earlier excitement had faded into a serene, focused expression, as if the very air around him was pulling him forward. Every so often, he would glance back at her, a smile tugging at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze had become distant, far away, as though he was seeing something that Emma could not. "Isn't it beautiful, Emma?" he said quietly, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "I told you it was real. I knew it would be. I knew this was where it was supposed to happen." His words, though soft, sent a chill down Emma's spine. There was something off about his tone, something that didn't quite match his usual childlike wonder. She forced a smile, trying to reassure herself, but her stomach twisted uneasily. The further they went, the more intense the feeling of being watched became. It wasn't just the trees, it was something else. Something alive. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a cold shiver that spread through her body. Her eyes flicked from side to side, her heart pounding as she tried to pinpoint the source of her discomfort. Then she felt it. A soft, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a sudden pressure, as though something unseen was moving just at the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, expecting to see a person or animal, but there was nothing. The woods were still, as if nothing had changed. Yet the weight of the unseen presence remained, hanging over her like a thick fog. Emma swallowed hard, trying to calm the rising panic that gripped her chest. She glanced back at the path they had traveled, but the house was no longer visible. The farm, her safety, was far behind them, swallowed by the shadows. "Timmy," Emma called softly, her voice tight, "we should go back now. This doesn't feel right. It's too dark." Timmy didn't respond immediately. His steps had slowed, but he still walked ahead as if the woods were calling him forward, guiding him. Emma's eyes followed him, her body screaming at her to turn back, to run. But she couldn't leave him behind, not like this. Another chill ran through her as she took a step forward, the weight of the air growing heavier with each passing second. The rustle of the trees seemed to come from all around them now, a chorus of whispers too faint to understand but clear enough to make Emma's skin crawl. It felt as though the very forest was alive, its branches twisting, its leaves shifting with intent. Emma's gaze darted again, looking for something, anything that would explain the creeping dread spreading through her. But all she saw were the trees, stretching upward into the endless night. The feeling of being watched intensified, now accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a low hum, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't words, not really, just a melody that felt like it was vibrating deep in Emma's bones. It was distant, but close at the same time, surrounding her, seeping into her mind. She tried to focus on Timmy, tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination running wild. The woods were old, the air thick with mystery and age. There had to be an explanation for this, a logical reason for the way the trees seemed to whisper and move. but nothing made sense. Nothing felt right. "Emma, come on." Timmy's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, and she looked up to see him a few steps ahead, almost at the edge of the clearing. The figure, that thing, was just ahead, standing in the middle of the glade, its wings glowing softly against the black backdrop of the woods. Timmy's eyes were wide, his face illuminated by the figure's light, his body still moving forward, every step taken with the kind of certainty that scared Emma more than anything else. She wanted to scream, to call out to him, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to stop him, to pull him away from the figure, but she couldn't make her body move. The weight of the presence around them was too strong. It was as though the very ground beneath her feet was holding her in place, preventing her from turning back. As Emma stood frozen, the humming sound seemed to grow louder, closer, until it was all she could hear. It was as though the woods themselves were calling to her, urging her forward, urging her to join Timmy in the light. To step into that glowing presence, to give in to whatever force was beckoning her. But Emma couldn't do it. She knew better, despite the overwhelming pull of the woods, despite the figure's quiet invitation. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as she fought against the compulsion to move. "Timmy, stop," she finally managed to yell, her voice breaking through the trance-like pull. "This isn't safe. Don't go any closer." But it was too late. Timmy was already in the clearing, his hand outstretched toward the figure, his face filled with awe. Emma's stomach twisted, and a feeling of dread gripped her so fiercely she thought she might choke. The figure's wings fluttered softly in the night air, the light around it flickering like a distant star, and Emma knew, deep in her bones, that they had crossed a line. The woods were no longer just a place of shadows. It was a place of something else, something old, ancient, and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. And now, it was waiting for them. Emma's heart raced as she watched Timmy, standing at the edge of the clearing, still transfixed by the glowing figure. The light from its wings seemed to ripple through the air, casting strange, dancing shadows across his face. His eyes were wide, filled with a strange. There were no answers. No explanations. Only the haunting hum of the glowing figure's wings and the oppressive stillness of the forest around her. Her gaze locked onto the spot where Timmy had been, where he had vanished into the glowing light. For a moment, Emma's mind refused to accept it. She blinked, willing the scene to change, willing her brother to reappear, to laugh and wave at her as if it were all some cruel game. But the clearing was empty now, empty, except for the figure that stood so unnaturally still in the center, its wings glowing like a beacon in the dark. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and Emma stumbled backward, her knees buckling. She fell to the ground with a harsh gasp, her hands digging into the dirt, trying to ground herself. She could feel the cold earth beneath her fingertips, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. Timmy was gone. And the figure, whatever it was still there. A terrible, all-consuming feeling began to creep up from the pit of Emma's stomach. It wasn't just the fear of losing her brother that gripped her, there was something else. A pull, an inexplicable draw that tugged at her chest, urging her forward, toward the light, toward the figure. It wasn't strong enough to overpower her, not yet, but it was there, lurking, like a whisper in the back of her mind, reminding her of its presence. She shook her head violently, as if to clear the thoughts, but they wouldn't go away. The hum of the wings grew louder in her ears, and she could feel it in her bones now, vibrating through the air. The light from the figure seemed to pulse, like the beat of a heart, steady, rhythmic, irresistible. "No. No, I can't," she whispered aloud, her voice a hoarse tremor in the stillness. I can't go to it. But the pull didn't relent. It was subtle, like the wind tugging at her hair, like a gentle nudge against her shoulder. It wasn't forceful, wasn't aggressive, it was simply there, growing stronger with every passing second. Emma's fingers curled into the dirt, desperately trying to steady herself. She wanted to fight it, wanted to run, to find Timmy and drag him back from wherever he had gone. She wanted to scream, to make sense of what was happening. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, all she could feel was the unsettling pull of the figure, the unspoken invitation, the promise of something beyond the world she knew. It felt like a kind of longing, deep inside her, a desire to be closer to it, to understand it, to be part of what was happening here. A part of her knew it was wrong, knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't something to be trusted. But another part of her, the part that trembled in her chest, wanted to step into the light, wanted to belong to it, as Timmy now did. Emma's breath quickened, and her thoughts began to spiral. She wanted to protect her brother, she had to protect him, but that pull, that quiet, insistent whisper, was growing stronger by the second. She could almost hear it, just beneath the hum of the wings, a voice that called her by name, a voice that seemed to wrap itself around her thoughts, like soft silk, smooth and dangerous. Come closer. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms as if the pain would stop the urge, would keep her from following the pull. But it was no use. The more she resisted, the stronger it became. It was as if the figure's light was alive, feeding on her fear, drawing her in, testing her resolve. Emma's entire body screamed for her to run, to flee, but her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. Her heartbeat was erratic now, faster than it should be, pounding in her ears, urging her to listen, to respond. Timmy, I have to save you, she whispered hoarsely, her voice shaking. But as she spoke, her feet seemed to move of their own accord, dragging her closer to the figure. She reached out, her hand trembling in the air, like it was instinctively trying to bridge the distance, to connect with the thing that had taken her brother. No, I won't, she gritted through her teeth, shaking her head, desperately trying to break free from the thrall of the light. But her body moved again, inching forward. The voice seemed to grow louder now, though it was still only a whisper, still just beyond the reach of her understanding. But it was there, clear as day, calling to her. It was soft, sweet, but underneath it was a hint of something sinister, something that spoke of ancient knowledge, of power, of things far beyond her comprehension. You belong here, too. The words slithered into her mind, cold and tempting. The light around the figure flickered again, casting strange shadows across the trees, and Emma could feel herself weakening. The urge to step closer, to join Timmy, to understand what was happening, was becoming unbearable. No, she gritted her teeth, fighting against the growing pull, the fog in her mind. I won't. I can't. But even as she said the words, she could feel herself slipping, her body betraying her. The presence, the light, the call, it was all too strong, all too overwhelming. The air itself seemed to hum with power, and Emma's resistance was slowly draining away. Just a little closer. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her legs shaking as she tried to fight against the instinct that now consumed her. She wanted to turn away, to save herself, to save her brother. But the pull was too strong. It was almost too late. Just one more step. And for the first time, Emma hesitated. Her body was still moving forward, but her mind screamed in defiance. There was something wrong. She knew it now. There was a price for everything, and Timmy's disappearance was only the beginning. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the cool night air wash over her, and when she opened them again, she made a choice. She had to fight. Had to save Timmy. And somehow, she had to resist the lure of the thing that seemed to call to her more than anything else in the world. Emma stood in the clearing, trembling, her entire body on edge. The quiet hum of the glowing figure's wings was still there, pulsing softly in the air, but it wasn't the only sound. There was something else, something subtle, something that sent a jolt of ice down her spine. It was a voice. It was faint at first, a whisper almost lost in the breeze. Emma strained to hear it, her breath shallow and uneven as she glanced nervously over her shoulder, searching for the source. The woods around her were still, but the darkness seemed thicker, heavier, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. She could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her, the oppressive quiet too much to bear. She blinked, trying to shake the unease from her mind, but the voice came again, this time clearer, though still no louder than a breath. Emma. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice, it was her name. The syllables were soft and melodic, almost loving in their gentleness. Emma froze, her body tense, her pulse quickening. Her name, spoken in such a tender, coaxing way, seemed to reach into the deepest parts of her, filling her chest with a strange, unsettling warmth. For a moment, she thought she imagined it, thought that maybe the fear and anxiety were playing tricks on her mind. She couldn't trust her senses anymore. This forest was a maze of shadows, a place where reality seemed to warp, where even the most familiar sounds could twist into something unrecognizable. But the voice came again, this time closer, the tone even softer, yet undeniably real. Emma, come. Her breath caught in her throat. She whipped around, her eyes darting in the darkness, searching for the source of the voice, but the clearing was empty. The figure remained still at the center of the woods, its wings flickering like distant stars, its presence as commanding as ever. Yet the voice, it felt as if it was coming from within the very trees themselves, as if the forest had come alive, speaking directly to her. A part of her wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but the words died in her throat, suffocated by the pull of the voice. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it sounded so familiar, like something deep within her, something buried and forgotten. The voice held an undeniable power, a gentle insistence that made her stomach churn and her heart race. The feeling of being watched returned, even more intense than before. Her breath felt shallow, as though she was being suffocated by the very air around her. The darkness seemed to close in, and the shadows around the trees lengthened, creeping closer to her like fingers stretching to grab hold. Emma, it's safe here. The voice was more insistent now, smooth and persuasive. There was no anger, no malice in it, only an undeniable calm that settled over her like a soft blanket. It wasn't a command, but an invitation, a gentle urging to step closer, to cross that invisible line into the unknown. The promise of safety, of belonging, called to her from the very depths of the forest. She swallowed hard, her mind battling against the weight of the words. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. She had to resist. And yet, Emma. There it was again, her name, whispered on the wind, barely audible but powerful, a song that tugged at the edges of her consciousness. She could feel it now, the pull, the undeniable temptation to listen, to obey. Could it be real? Was someone else out there? Or was it just the forest playing tricks on her, making her lose her grip on reality? She glanced over at Timmy's empty spot in the clearing, the place where he had disappeared into the light. His absence weighed heavily on her chest, a reminder of what had already been taken. The thought of losing him forever made her heart ache, and she longed to reach out, to somehow pull him back from wherever he had gone. But the voice, the whisper that called her name, seemed to promise something more, something greater. It was as if it was offering her a choice, a way to join him, to find him again, to be part of something bigger than the world she had known. Her legs felt weak, the struggle within her growing harder with each passing second. She wanted to turn and run, to leave the forest and never look back. But the voice, it was so comforting, so familiar. She couldn't escape it. It was in her mind, in her blood, like a part of her that she couldn't deny. "Come to me," the voice was almost a caress now, so soft, so welcoming. Emma took a step forward without even realizing it. Her feet moved, drawn by the gentle pull, the aching need to know what lay just beyond the trees. She glanced back at the safety of the farm in the distance, but it felt so far away, like it no longer belonged to her. The light from the figure pulsed again, flickering like a star in the deep night. Emma's body moved forward another step, her gaze fixed on the glowing wings, her mind clouded by the whisper that continued to echo in her mind, urging her to come closer. The voice spoke once more, and this time it was not just her name it called, but something else, something that made her blood run cold. "You're already here." The words wrapped themselves around her heart, and Emma stumbled to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. What did it mean? Was she already lost? Was she already part of the forest, a part of the light? She stood there, trapped between the desire to follow and the instinct to run, the voice still echoing in her mind, urging her to give in, to step closer to the figure and never turn back. The forest was alive, and she was just another piece of it, another thread in its tangled web. But Emma wasn't ready to let go, not yet. Not yet. She clenched her fists, shaking her head as she fought against the voice. She had to stay grounded. She couldn't let herself fall into its grasp. Timmy was still out there, somewhere, and she needed to find him. She had to fight this pull, had to resist the lure of the voice before it consumed her, too. But as the whisper faded into the night, leaving only the sound of her ragged breath and the soft rustling of the trees, Emma knew deep down that the battle was just beginning. Emma stood motionless in the clearing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, dread, and a creeping sense of something familiar. She had heard the stories, of course, the old warnings whispered by the adults in the town. The tales of children who wandered too deep into the woods and were never seen again. But those were just stories, weren't they? Local legends designed to frighten young ones, to keep them close to home, to make them wary of the unknown. Her pulse quickened as the voice, still faint but insistent, continued to echo in her ears. It called to her, soothing and soft, coaxing her to step forward, to lose herself in the light that pulsed like the beating of some ancient heart. But even as she felt herself drawn to it, something deeper, more primal, whispered within her, a gnawing discomfort that made her chest tighten. She knew this feeling. Her eyes flicked across the woods, searching for some sign, some clue that would tell her this was just a nightmare she could wake up from. The familiar weight of the silence pressed in on her, the absence of the usual forest sounds, no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. The air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Then it came to her, sudden and sharp, like a bolt of lightning splitting the night sky. The old stories. The legends her mother had told her to never believe. The warnings she brushed off as fairy tales, meant to keep children from wandering too far. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, the words spoken in hushed tones around the dinner table when Emma was younger. There are things in those woods, Emma, things that take people. Things that lure you in with promises, with sweet whispers. And once you're in their grasp, there's no way out. You disappear, and no one can bring you back. The memory hit Emma like a flood, drowning her thoughts. Her mother had always insisted it was just a story, a warning wrapped in myth to keep children safe. But now, standing in the heart of the forest with the eerie glow of the figure in front of her, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the stories were more than just warnings. The legends were real. Her breath caught in her throat as the voice called her again. "Emma, come to me." It was so gentle, so inviting. But now, in the dim light of the forest, it was chilling. There was something so wrong about it. The way it seemed to reach into her mind, pull her thoughts apart, like it knew her. Like it had been waiting for her. Déjà vu. The sensation slammed into her like a wave, so powerful she could hardly breathe. She had never felt this before, not like this, not in this moment, but somehow, she knew what was happening. It was like she had been here before, like she had stood in this exact place, feeling this exact same pull, hearing that same whisper, but at the same time, it was something new, something that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. This isn't real. She tried to tell herself, but even her own thoughts felt distant, foggy, as though the very ground beneath her was slipping away. She felt detached, as if her body was no longer her own. The forest seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching longer, darker. She shook her head fiercely, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't think like this. She couldn't let herself believe what her gut was telling her. It had to be a coincidence. But the stories. Her mother had told her that the children who disappeared in the woods never returned. That once they crossed into the heart of the forest, they were taken, hidden in the dark places where no one could reach them. The ones who followed the light never came back. They became part of the forest, servants to whatever ancient, dark force ruled the woods. Timmy. The thought of her brother, lost somewhere in the dark, pulled at her heart. He had followed the light. He had been taken. She knew it. But the thought of him, wherever he was, whatever he had become, sent a wave of terror through her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the truth of what was happening. Could it be? Could it be that the stories her mother had told were true? That the figure she saw now, with its glowing wings and haunting presence, was not a simple trick of the light or her imagination? Could it be something older, something worse? The figure flickered again, the light pulsating like the breath of something alive. It called to her, whispered her name, coaxed her to come closer. But Emma couldn't move. The terror rooted her to the spot, her legs locked in place, as though the very air around her was holding her still. The pull was overwhelming, but the stories, the legends that had once seemed so far away, so impossible to believe, now felt too real. She knew the woods were full of dark things. She knew that whatever was out there, whatever had taken Timmy, would take her too if she wasn't careful. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the voice, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of déjà vu that had settled over her. It was as though she had lived this moment before, stood in this clearing, with the figure waiting, calling, beckoning her to come closer. But she refused. She wouldn't fall into the trap. She had to save Timmy. She had to get out of the woods before it was too late. Emma opened her eyes, her hands trembling at her sides. The figure was still there, its wings glowing, still beckoning. But she couldn't let it win. She wouldn't let the pull of the woods take her like it had taken the others. Not her. Not now. Not yet. She took a deep, steadying breath. She wasn't sure where the courage came from, but she couldn't stay there any longer. She had to find Timmy. She had to get out before the forest took her, too. The moment Emma moved forward, the woods seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a faint chill that wasn't there moments before. But as they ventured deeper, the sensation grew more intense, more suffocating. It was as if the trees themselves were leaning in, growing closer, casting shadows that twisted and bent around them. The ground beneath their feet was soft, damp with dew, but the path ahead became harder to see, as though the very light was being swallowed by the thick canopy above. The once familiar smell of pine and fresh earth was now replaced by a musty, stagnant odor, as though the woods hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The air hung heavy, damp with the weight of silence. Emma's heart raced. She couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. The woods weren't just darkening, it felt as though the trees themselves were closing in on her, pressing in from all sides. She had been to these woods 100 times before, playing with Timmy as a child, but this was different. The trees were too dense now, too close together, as if the forest itself was narrowing its grip, making it harder to escape. She glanced over at Timmy, his eyes wide with an almost frantic excitement, his face alight as though he didn't even notice the growing darkness around them. He had been so drawn to the figure, so caught in its glow, that it seemed like nothing else mattered to him anymore. Emma, however, couldn't shake the growing unease creeping up her spine, the pressing weight in the air making it harder to breathe. She glanced up. The sky above was a thin sliver now, barely visible through the thick web of branches. The sun seemed to have disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a dim, unnatural twilight. Every few steps, Emma felt the darkness grow thicker, like the forest itself was swallowing the daylight, wrapping them in its suffocating embrace. "Timmy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but he jerked away slightly, lost in the rhythm of his steps, his attention completely consumed by the glowing figure ahead. He didn't respond. The forest felt alive in a way Emma couldn't explain. She swore she heard things moving in the shadows, the soft rustling of leaves, only it wasn't the wind. It was like something was following them, just out of sight, its presence felt rather than seen. The sounds of the woods had changed, too, once familiar and peaceful, now eerily quiet, with only the occasional creak of the trees or the distant snap of a twig breaking the silence. But even those sounds seemed strange now, too slow, too deliberate. The trees stretched overhead, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes, reaching down toward them like skeletal fingers. Every step Emma took seemed to be swallowed by the dense underbrush, the earth sucking her in, refusing to let go. She could feel the air getting colder, the weight of it pressing in around her like an unseen force. She shivered, rubbing her arms to ward off the cold, but it was no use. The chill seemed to settle on her bones. A part of her, something primal, wanted to turn back, to run back to the safety of the open field, the safety of the known. But the further they walked, the more she felt that the way back was no longer the way forward. She stumbled on a root that curled out of the ground, the force of her misstep sending a jolt of panic through her. Her eyes darted around. The trees had seemed so open and inviting when they first entered, but now they were closing in, the trunks more massive, the branches more oppressive. The very ground beneath her seemed to shift, the path narrowing as if the woods themselves were trying to block her escape. Timmy wasn't looking back. His gaze remained fixed on the light ahead, his feet moving without hesitation. He was too far gone, too drawn to the figure ahead. Emma tried to call his name, to pull him back, but her voice was lost in the oppressive silence. "Timmy," she said again, this time more forcefully. Her voice seemed to get swallowed by the woods, absorbed by the thick air. He didn't turn, didn't respond. He just kept walking forward, faster now, as though in a trance, the glow from the figure ahead pulsing in the growing gloom. Emma felt her heart hammer in her chest. This wasn't right. The woods, this whole place, it was wrong. The stories her mother had told her, the warnings, they were all coming back to her now, and with them, the chilling realization that there was no turning back once they reached the heart of these woods. The trees, they weren't just trees. They were the keepers of something older, something darker. She had heard the tales as a child, but she had never really believed them. They were just stories, warnings. But now, standing in the heart of the woods, the weight of those stories bore down on her like a crushing weight. The trees were closing in. The branches above seemed to stretch lower now, thicker, heavier, and the air felt as though it was thickening, like the space between them was shrinking. She thought she could hear the faintest creaking of wood, like the very forest was shifting around them, pulling them deeper into its embrace. Emma's skin prickled, her every instinct telling her to run. The familiar sense of safety was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread, a sense of being watched, of being pursued. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the deeper they went, the less she felt in control. The path was narrowing, the trees growing closer, and the light, the figure, seemed to be pulling them forward with an inexorable force. She reached out to Timmy again, her hand shaking, but he didn't acknowledge her. His face was expressionless, his body moving in a strange, unsteady rhythm, as though the world around him had faded, leaving only the figure at the center of the forest. Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she felt the weight of the forest closing in around them. The way back was disappearing, and the deeper they went, the more Emma felt herself slipping into something ancient, something alive. The woods weren't just watching them, they were waiting. And Emma realized, with rising terror, that they were already too deep to escape. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched the glowing figure ahead of them. At first, it had seemed like a trick of the light, an illusion conjured by the flickering shadows between the trees. But now, as they moved deeper into the woods, it was unmistakable. The figure was real, and it was leading them. Gliding just ahead, as though it was floating above the earth, the soft glow surrounding it pulsed like a heartbeat. Each step it took seemed to draw them in further, like the thread of a spider's web pulling them closer to the center. Timmy, oblivious to Emma's growing terror, had quickened his pace. He was moving with an unnatural speed now, no longer stumbling or hesitating as he had at the start. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the figure. He didn't look around, didn't check if Emma was still there, if she was keeping up. It was as though the rest of the world no longer mattered to him, as though the only thing in existence was the figure and its radiant light. "Timmy," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no response. Her brother's face was blank, his expression distant, as if he were somewhere far away, lost to the world around him. The pull of the figure seemed to have completely overtaken him. Emma's own footsteps slowed. The weight of the forest around her seemed to grow heavier with every step. The trees closed in tighter, their trunks so thick now that the space between them felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if the woods themselves were being swallowed by the night. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves, was oppressive, as though the forest was holding its breath. But the figure, it was the only thing that seemed alive. Its wings, glowing softly, flickered like the light of a distant star. It moved with fluid grace, its every movement perfectly synchronized with the shifting shadows. It was always just ahead, gliding forward without ever seeming to hurry, as though it knew they would follow. Emma tried to stay behind it, to keep her distance, but the pull was undeniable. The closer she got, the stronger it became. "Come to me." The thought floated through her mind, unbidden but strong, like the whisper of a voice that was not her own. She wanted to resist, to fight it, but the more she tried, the harder it became to pull her thoughts away from the figure. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, no, monitored, as if the very forest was waiting for her next move. Every step she took, every breath she drew, seemed to be met with 1,000 eyes, hidden in the branches, peering from the darkness between the trees. It was only when she took another step that she realized how much closer she had gotten to the glowing figure. Her heart raced in her chest, pounding loudly in her ears. She tried to stop, tried to pull herself back, but it was as if the forest had caught her in its trap. The woods had closed in too tightly, and there was nowhere left to turn. The figure, sensing her hesitation, seemed to pause for a moment, turning slightly as if acknowledging her presence. Its glowing wings fluttered, and the soft light around it intensified, flickering with a kind of unnatural energy that made Emma's stomach churn. "Stay close." The whisper came again, more urgent this time. She was sure she hadn't imagined it, that it was coming from the figure itself. The light pulsed again, more brightly now, and Emma could feel its energy seeping into her, pulling her forward. She took a step, then another, and suddenly it felt as though her feet were no longer her own. They moved of their own accord, following the figure's lead without her conscious will. Her thoughts swirled. She wanted to stop, to scream, but her mouth felt dry, and her voice wouldn't come. She felt compelled to follow, to keep moving deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. "Emma, come on." Timmy's voice cut through her fog of fear. She hadn't realized how far ahead he had gone. He was already at the edge of the next clearing, his face still as vacant as before, his eyes fixed on the figure. He was waiting for her. With a rush of panic, Emma snapped back to herself. "No," she thought desperately. "This isn't real. This isn't my brother. This is something else." But she couldn't stop moving. The more she resisted, the stronger the pull became, like the figure was reaching into her very soul, drawing her forward with an invisible thread. It wasn't just the figure's movement that had changed. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the very atmosphere was thickening. The light from the figure, once gentle, now burned into her eyes, making it difficult to see anything else. The edges of her vision blurred, and the world around her faded into a wash of light and shadow. The more she focused on the figure, the less she could perceive the world around her. Everything else, the trees, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of unseen animals, seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving only the figure and the pull it exerted on her. "Timmy, stop!" Emma cried out, her voice breaking through the haze. She was closer now, only a few feet from her brother, but still unable to break free of the figure's grip. It was too strong, too overwhelming. She couldn't fight it anymore. But then, just as she was about to reach Timmy, the figure stopped. It floated before them both, turning slightly as if considering something. Its wings shimmered with an otherworldly light, and for the first time, Emma noticed that there was something wrong about its shape, something inhuman lurking beneath its delicate, glowing exterior. The whisper came again, this time directly in her ear. "Stay, forever." A chill ran down Emma's spine as she realized, too late, that she had walked straight into the heart of the forest, and that the figure, whatever it was, had no intention of letting them leave. The figure ahead seemed to glide effortlessly, as if the earth below it didn't matter. With each step, it remained just within reach, beckoning them forward, its glowing wings fluttering in a delicate, hypnotic rhythm. Emma's eyes were fixed on it, and she could feel an unsettling pull deep within her chest, a magnetic force drawing her in closer, inch by inch, despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back. Timmy, caught in a trance, was already moving faster, his small feet barely making a sound on the damp forest floor. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back to check on Emma. His whole attention was consumed by the figure. It was as though he couldn't hear her anymore, couldn't feel her presence at all. His movements had grown stiff, unnatural, as if his body was no longer his own. "Timmy," Emma whispered, but her voice barely made it past her lips. The words felt hollow in the thick air around her. The glow from the figure pulsed, brightening for a moment, and Emma's breath caught. It was as if the light from the figure had become more intense, more insistent, as though it knew it was pulling them into its grasp. She could see it more clearly now, a delicate, almost translucent being, its wings shimmering like the finest gossamer, yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. Its form flickered like a shadow in the light, as though it weren't entirely real, and every time Emma blinked, it seemed to shift ever so slightly. Her feet moved without her command. She tried to stop, tried to focus on something, anything, to break the pull, but the more she resisted, the stronger the sensation grew. It was as if the forest itself had grown silent around her, the sounds of the world muffled, leaving only the soft, rhythmic pulse of the glowing figure as her guide. The trees around her seemed to grow denser the further she went, their trunks thickening and crowding the path, forcing her to keep moving forward. The shadows between the trunks stretched long and twisted, bending in strange angles as if the forest was alive, watching her, guiding her steps toward the center. The ground beneath her feet was soft, damp with moisture, and the air felt cooler, heavier. Every breath she took seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on her. Timmy was too far ahead now. She called his name again, but this time it was more of a gasp than a plea. Her throat tightened, the fear in her chest rising with every step. But the figure, gliding just ahead, didn't stop. It didn't falter. It was leading them deeper, further into the unknown, with an inevitability that made Emma's stomach churn. Her steps grew faster, as though her body no longer belonged to her, each movement more compelled, more desperate. The pull became overwhelming, stronger than anything she had ever felt before. It was as if something invisible was pressing against her chest, pushing her forward. She couldn't stop it, couldn't fight it. The figure was always just out of reach, like a dream she couldn't wake up from, leading her further into the forest's embrace. The trees that once seemed welcoming, familiar, were now strange and foreign, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as though they had been standing for centuries, waiting for her. Their branches interlocked above, forming a canopy that blocked out the remaining light, casting the forest into an unnatural twilight. The path they followed seemed to narrow, the space between the trees closing in, squeezing her into an ever-tighter grip. The forest had become a maze, and the figure was the only way out. With every step, the air grew thicker, heavier, like it was filled with something she couldn't see, something ancient and watching. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull herself away. She had to keep going. And then, as if it had sensed her growing hesitation, the figure stopped. It hovered before them, turning just enough to face Emma. The light from its wings flickered in and out, casting strange, shifting shadows on the trees. The glow seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She could feel its gaze, though its eyes remained hidden in the light. It was watching her. No, it was waiting for her. Timmy was still walking, oblivious to the momentary pause, his steps steady, unwavering. He didn't even glance back. But Emma couldn't move. It was like the forest itself had frozen in place, holding her in its grip. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground, her body frozen as if under a spell. And then, the figure moved again, just a fraction, a subtle shift that seemed to draw Emma closer. The pull grew even stronger, the magnetic force intensifying, until it felt like she could feel it in her bones. The glowing being, now just a few feet away, seemed to extend its wings slightly, as though inviting her to come closer. A whisper echoed in her mind, distant at first but growing clearer, until Emma could almost hear it with her ears. "Come closer. It's safe. You're almost here." Her pulse quickened. The words were not spoken aloud, but they resonated deep within her, vibrating through her chest. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, from the trees, from the very ground beneath her, from the air itself. And, in that moment, Emma realized the truth. The figure wasn't just leading them deeper into the woods. It was leading them somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't even begin to understand. Her head spun. Every part of her screamed to run, to break free from the figure's pull, but she couldn't. Her legs moved, though her mind tried to fight it. The path ahead was no longer just a path. It was the way to something darker, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The pull intensified, and she felt her feet moving forward once more, unwillingly, irresistibly. The figure was leading them, not out of the woods, but deeper into its heart. The moment the figure glided forward, leaving Emma standing at the edge of the clearing, everything fell silent. It was as if the entire forest had stopped breathing. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the faint scurrying of animals beneath the underbrush, every sound, every vibration, faded into nothing. Emma's ears rang with the absence of noise, the silence suffocating in its depth. The world around her had gone still, and the stillness felt unnatural, wrong, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her heart raced in her chest as she stood frozen, her feet unwilling to move. Every inch of her body screamed to turn around, to run, to escape whatever this place had become, but her legs wouldn't obey. The air around her felt thick, heavy, pressing against her like a physical weight. It was as if the very space she occupied was being swallowed by the darkness creeping in from the edges of the woods. And then, softly at first, came the whispers. At first, it was so faint that Emma thought she might have imagined it, a breath of wind, or rustling leaf, or perhaps the distant murmur of voices carried on the breeze. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until it was undeniable. They were voices, soft, melodic voices, like a lullaby sung just out of reach, but not quite a song. "Emma, come closer." The voice was familiar, but wrong, like a memory that didn't quite belong, like something that had been twisted into a shape that didn't fit. It was a whisper that tugged at the edges of her mind, pulling her thoughts away from her surroundings, pulling her closer into the darkness. "We've been waiting for you." The voice was more insistent now, no longer a whisper, but a soft, rhythmic chant that echoed through the trees. It felt like the forest itself was speaking to her, its branches, its roots, its very soil murmuring in unison, urging her to take another step forward. Her eyes flicked toward the figure, now only a blur in the distance, moving further into the woods, its glow flickering like a fading star. The figure didn't look back, it simply led the way, drifting through the thick shadows. Emma's eyes darted around her, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She wanted to scream, wanted to shout for Timmy, to demand that he stop and come back, but the silence around her was too thick. Her voice would not break through it. The whispers grew louder. "Don't fight it. Come to us, Emma. You belong here." The words slithered into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils. They were not her own, yet they felt so familiar, so comforting. They promised something: peace, release, freedom from the fear that had been building in her chest. They made the darkness around her feel less threatening, less suffocating, as if it were a safe place, a place where she could escape from the weight of the world. Come closer. The voices were everywhere now. She couldn't tell where they were coming from: above her, from the trees, beneath her feet, from the figure. It didn't matter. It was as though the very forest was alive, its voice echoing through every inch of the woods, coaxing her forward. The whispers didn't sound malicious, they sounded gentle, soothing, like an invitation to something just beyond her reach. Her body shuddered. She could feel the warmth of the figure's presence still lingering in the air, a magnetic force that pulled at her even from the distance. The whispers were like the figure's extension, soft, insistent, pulling her towards it like a moth to a flame. It felt like the forest was drawing her into its heart, and she was powerless to resist. Timmy was still somewhere ahead, lost in the thrall of the figure's glow, but Emma's attention was pulled back to the whispering voices that seemed to come from within the woods themselves. She took a step forward, almost without thinking, her foot pressing against the damp earth. The path seemed to open up before her, and as her foot fell, she realized just how far she had wandered, how deep she had gone into the heart of the forest. The world she knew, the world outside these woods, felt distant, unreal, as if it no longer existed at all. Come closer, Emma. She felt it again, the soft, insistent pull. Something within her tugged back, a flicker of resistance, a glimmer of the fear that had kept her grounded before. She wasn't sure if it was her will or the whispering voices guiding her, but her body moved forward, step by step, against the growing storm of doubt in her chest. The whispers weren't merely voices, they were promises. They spoke of belonging, of safety, of a place where the cold, empty silence of the world would never touch her. It was a strange comfort, a strange assurance that she would finally find the peace that had eluded her for so long. The forest had changed. It no longer felt like the place she had known before. The darkness had thickened, the shadows stretched longer, and the very air seemed heavy with a presence that wasn't quite natural. It felt as if the forest itself was aware of her, watching her every move, its branches creaking and groaning as if alive with anticipation. But it was the silence that had turned her world upside down, the silence that swallowed everything else whole. The sounds of the world were gone, replaced by those quiet whispers, and as the shadows deepened, Emma's sense of reality slipped further away. Emma's mind swirled with confusion, the whispers in her ears growing louder, pulling at the very fabric of her thoughts. She couldn't tear herself away from the oppressive silence, the pull of the darkened woods growing stronger with every passing moment. But then, through the thick shadows, a flicker of light caught her eye. At first, it was faint, like a dying star struggling to remain alight. But as her eyes adjusted, the glow grew brighter, unnaturally so, its light twisting and distorting as though it were caught between two worlds. And there, in the clearing before her, the figure reappeared. But this time, Emma saw it more clearly. It wasn't the gentle, glowing fairy she had once believed it to be. No, it was something far darker, far more sinister. Its wings, once delicate and shimmering, now appeared jagged and broken, like shattered glass, each flutter casting strange, flickering shadows on the trees. The light that radiated from it was uneven, flickering erratically like a faulty bulb, casting sharp, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally across the forest floor. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped back, her feet now rooted to the spot. The figure wasn't just glowing, it was distorting, its light warping in and out like a mirage. Each time it flickered, The shape of the figure seemed to shift, its outline becoming more fluid, more impossible. It was no longer a creature of light, but a creature of distortion, a being that didn't belong in this world. She had been wrong. This wasn't a fairy. The figure stretched, its wings snapping open with a sound like the cracking of dry branches. They weren't graceful and ethereal. They were sharp, jagged, as if the very act of movement caused the light to fracture and tear at the seams. The creature's body, once vaguely human in form, was now a twisted silhouette, with no clear features except for its glowing eyes, two pinpricks of light that stared directly into Emma's soul. This isn't right, Emma thought, her pulse quickening. The pull she had felt before, now it felt like a trap, a lure. She had been walking deeper into the forest, deeper into its grasp, not because of some innocent creature, but because of something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The whispers seemed to echo from all directions now, growing louder and more insistent. "Come closer, Emma." No, she had to stop. She had to turn back. Emma shook her head violently, trying to break free from the trance that seemed to cloud her thoughts. She couldn't let the figure draw her any further, couldn't let herself fall deeper into its web. But every time she looked at it, the figure's form seemed to pull her closer, its twisted, flickering glow wrapping around her like a noose. It was then that Emma realized the truth. This creature, whatever it was, had been leading them all along, not to a fairy tale or a place of wonder, but to something far more terrifying. It had been waiting in the woods, patiently, for them, for children, for souls to wander into its domain. It had lured Timmy and her into its trap with promises of light and safety, of something beyond the reach of the ordinary world. But it wasn't leading them out of the forest. It was leading them deeper into its domain. Her eyes flicked to Timmy, who stood beside the creature now, his eyes glazed over, distant. He was too far gone. She couldn't reach him. His small, fragile body stood motionless, as if his soul had already been claimed by the creature. His face was pale, his features unnaturally calm, as though he were no longer truly there, but somewhere else, lost in the glow of the figure's distorted light. "Timmy!" The word exploded from Emma's lips, but it fell flat in the silence, swallowed whole by the dark woods. The whispers continued, louder now, speaking directly to her, urging her closer to the creature, to the glowing form that was no longer a fairy but something darker, something with a purpose that made Emma's skin crawl. "Come closer, Emma. You'll see. It's not too late. You'll be safe here." The voices weren't just calling her now. They were insisting, their tones rising in a growing crescendo that vibrated through her bones. Emma could feel the pull becoming unbearable. It was like an invisible hand was clutching her heart, dragging her forward, every instinct screaming to turn and run, but her feet betrayed her, pushing her deeper, closer to the figure. Her mind raced. There had to be a way to break free, to escape this twisted place. But the longer she stood there, the harder it became to think, to focus. The figure's glow danced in her vision, a flickering beacon of something far darker than she had imagined. The whispers blended together into one overwhelming voice, and the world around her began to dissolve into shadows, leaving only the figure, only its warped light, standing before her. "Don't be afraid, Emma. Come into the light." The words rang in her mind like a final command, and her legs took another step forward, her body no longer her own. She was so close now, closer than she had ever been. The figure's glowing form reached out toward her, its wings stretching wide, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was about to do. The light around the figure flickered one last time, revealing something else in the depths of the forest, something far darker, far more sinister than Emma had ever dared to imagine. The light did not belong to the figure alone. It was a beacon, a signal, a trap, and she had walked straight into it. And as the figure reached out to her, her mind screamed in horror, but it was already too late. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, the very air around her growing thicker with every passing second. She could still feel the tug of the figure, its distorted glow pulling her forward like a chain, but now her mind was beginning to sharpen, her thoughts clearer, even amidst the overwhelming fear that gripped her. The realization hit her slowly, like a creeping fog, settling into her bones. The creature wasn't just a being of light, something ethereal and otherworldly. It wasn't just a fairy. It was something more ancient, more malevolent. She had been so blind before, caught in the brightness of its glow, fooled by its mesmerizing wings. But now, as the flickering light danced before her, she saw it for what it truly was, a predator. It was a creature that fed on something deeper than just a body, it fed on the soul. Her breath quickened as the words began to form in her mind. Fairy, yes, but not the kind of fairy whispered about in bedtime stories. This was no gentle, benevolent spirit. This was a creature that lured children, seduced them into its world with promises of safety, of light, and led them to their doom. The forest around her wasn't just a place of trees and wildlife, it was a trap. A prison for lost souls, its branches reaching out like fingers, guiding the unsuspecting deeper into its shadowed heart. Emma tried to look away, but the figure's eyes seemed to burn into her, drawing her in. The voice that had whispered in her ears was now louder, clearer, and it was no longer soft and coaxing, it was commanding, a voice that would not be denied. You can't run, Emma. You're already here. You belong here. The words swirled in her mind, repeating over and over again, like a chant. She tried to shake it off, tried to block out the voice, but it was too strong, too insistent. The figure's light, once comforting and warm, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and every step Emma took toward it felt like stepping further into a trap. But then, a sudden, terrible thought crossed her mind. Timmy, her brother. Where was he? Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of him, but the only thing she could see was the flickering form of the creature, its wings now fully extended, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. The creature was no longer alone. There, just behind it, Emma could make out faint shapes, figures that seemed to melt into the shadows, their faces pale, their eyes vacant, like ghosts bound to the creature's will. The realization struck like a lightning bolt. They were children. Her stomach churned as she looked at the figures standing behind the fairy. The pale, ghostly faces belonged to children, just like her brother, Timmy. They stood still, like statues, their eyes wide and unblinking, their faces blank and lifeless. They were lost, trapped in this dark place, unable to escape. And they weren't just here by accident. They had been led here, just like Timmy, just like Emma. The figure before her was not just a fairy, it was the keeper of this prison, a warden who led children to the woods to be claimed, their spirits consumed by the forest, leaving behind only hollow shells of what they once were. Emma could almost feel their sadness, their desperation, their endless wandering in the dark. The fairy didn't just lure them in, it fed on their fear, their confusion, and once they were lost, they were trapped forever. Timmy. Emma whispered his name, but it came out like a prayer. She couldn't lose him too. She couldn't let him become one of them, one of the lost souls bound to this cursed place. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. The legends she had heard growing up, the stories whispered by the locals about children vanishing into the woods, they hadn't been just stories, they were warnings. Warnings of this dark creature that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for children to wander too far, to follow the glowing light, to become its. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to save Timmy, to escape the forest before the same thing happened to her. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its presence looming over Emma like a shadow, and the whispers grew louder again, their cadence almost hypnotic. You are mine now, Emma. Just like all the others. Just like Timmy. Come, join us. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as if the very earth had a grip on her. The forest around her seemed to close in, its branches stretching like arms to trap her. The light from the figure flickered again, and for a split second, Emma thought she saw something else, something more monstrous, lurking just behind its distorted glow. The fairy's true form, perhaps. A thing that existed beyond the light, something far darker and more grotesque than the glow allowed her to see. But she couldn't linger on that thought for long. The figure was moving toward her now, its form shifting and flickering, its presence growing until it felt like the entire forest was alive with its power. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble as it approached. She had to think. She had to move. Emma's hand instinctively reached for her brother, but the forest was not forgiving. Her eyes locked on Timmy, his body still standing motionless, a puppet controlled by the fairy's power. He wasn't lost, not yet, but he was slipping further away with each passing second. Timmy, hold on, she thought, her breath catching in her throat. But the creature's voice broke through, softer now, more seductive. It's too late, Emma. It's already begun. You belong to us now. All of you. The forest, the figure, the lost children, it was all part of a much older, darker secret. And Emma was only beginning to understand just how deep this curse ran, how far it reached. The forest wasn't just a trap, it was alive, feeding off the souls of the lost, and she and Timmy were its latest victims. But Emma couldn't give up. Not yet. She still had a chance. She could still save them. She just had to find a way to escape the figure's grasp before it was too late. Before the forest claimed her, too. Emma's pulse raced as she tried to move, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to get away. She had to break free from the grip of the creature before it was too late, before she became just another lost soul, another child doomed to wander the forest forever. But as her feet shuffled back, as her heart pounded in her chest, something terrifying became clear. The trees, they weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shift in the distance, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. She blinked, thinking it was just the fear clouding her senses. But then it happened again, this time unmistakable. One of the towering trees to her left creaked, its thick, gnarled branches twisting and contorting like arms reaching out to trap her. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The path she had taken to get here, simple, straight, and clear, was no longer visible. The trees, which had once formed an inviting tunnel of light and shadow, had now closed in, their trunks thick and twisted, their branches thickening overhead, blocking out the faint moonlight that had filtered through before. The forest was shifting, changing, and it was no longer allowing her to leave. She turned, frantic, her heart now a drumbeat of terror in her chest. She tried to retrace her steps, but every time she moved, the trees seemed to grow, their trunks leaning closer, their branches reaching further, as if the entire forest were conspiring to keep her here. The path was gone. It was as though the woods themselves were alive, twisting and reshaping with every attempt to escape, a living entity that refused to let its prey slip away. The whispers, which had been coaxing her forward, now took on mocking tone, as if the forest itself was laughing at her attempt to break free. "There is no way out, Emma." The voice came from all around her now, soft, seductive, like a breath against her ear. "You were never meant to leave. You belong to the forest now." The realization struck her like a cold wave. She wasn't just lost in the woods. The woods had claimed her. Every tree, every shadow, every twisted root was now part of the trap that surrounded her. The forest had taken its hold, and there was no going back. Emma's gaze shot to Timmy, still standing motionless beside the creature, his vacant eyes now locked onto hers. Her brother hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken a word. But she could see it in his expression, the same emptiness she had seen in the other children's faces. The same hollow stare that suggested they were no longer truly there, just vessels for whatever dark force had taken control. "Timmy," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. But her brother didn't respond. He didn't even blink. The figure stepped forward, its flickering form casting eerie shadows on the ground. As it moved, the very forest seemed to shift with it, the trees bending and warping like marionette strings being pulled. The figure's glowing eyes locked with Emma's, and the forest pulled her gaze, holding her in place, forcing her to look. "Don't be afraid, Emma. You'll see, you'll understand soon enough." The creature's voice was now a low hum in her mind, smooth and insistent. "We are all part of the same, you and I. We were always meant to be together, part of the forest. It is a place of peace, of stillness. No more fear. No more pain." Emma's mind screamed against it. No. She wasn't part of the forest. She wasn't like the others. She had to fight. She had to find a way out. But the more she struggled, the more she tried to move, the more the trees tightened their grip. They weren't just blocking her, they were alive, shifting with every step, growing closer and closer, their roots creeping over the ground like tendrils reaching to hold her in place. She looked up again, and for a split second, she saw the forest in its true form, the trees, the shadows, the mist. They weren't just trees. They were the arms of a larger, darker entity, reaching, waiting, pulling her into its fold. The glowing figure before her was the warden, the keeper of this twisted realm, its job to lure in those who wandered too far and to feed them to the forest, to bind them to its eternal darkness. Her heart hammered harder in her chest as she realized the full extent of the horror she was facing. She wasn't just lost. She was being consumed. The forest had claimed her. She had no place in the outside world anymore. The figure's wings fluttered once more, the distorted glow flickering violently as it stretched toward her. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her feet were frozen to the ground. The forest's power was too strong, and the more she resisted, the more the trees pressed in on her, their branches twisting around her like ropes. "You can't escape, Emma." The voice was now a chorus of whispers, all speaking in unison. "You're one of us now. And soon, you'll help us draw in others, just like Timmy, just like the rest." Emma's eyes darted back to Timmy. He was still there, his vacant expression unchanging, his body unmoving. He was already lost, claimed by the forest, just like the others. And now, Emma was no different. She had thought she could fight back, thought she could escape. But the trees had already decided her fate. There was no way out. The forest would have its way. And she was just another lost soul. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of the silence around Emma. Her breath was shallow, quick, as she struggled to break free from the unyielding grip of the forest, but every time she moved, the trees closed in tighter, their branches snapping with unnatural force. It was as though the woods were alive, suffocating her with their presence. And then, just when she thought she could bear it no longer, a sound broke through the stillness. A voice. Soft. Faint. Emma. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The voice, her name, it sounded so real, so close. She spun around, her eyes desperately searching for the source, but there was nothing, only the twisting shadows of the trees. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, but the lingering feeling of someone calling her name, of someone waiting for her, sent a chill crawling up her spine. And then, another voice. Help me. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was there, so clear, so real. The voice was high-pitched, strained, like a child calling out for help. Emma's body went stiff, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. She knew it. It was Timmy. Timmy, she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. But there was no answer. Instead, the voices came again, this time louder, more numerous. Dozens of voices, all echoing through the trees, their words lost in the howling wind. They all sounded so familiar, so human. Children. Lost. Calling out from the darkness. Emma, come back. A voice begged, trembling with fear. Please, don't leave us. Timmy. Emma whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The voices were beginning to merge together, becoming a chorus of frantic, pleading calls, all begging her to join them, to come deeper into the woods. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. These weren't just random voices. They were the voices of children who had vanished here before. They were the ones who had been lured by the same creature, the same glowing figure, and they had never returned. She heard a laugh, too. Soft, almost mocking, as though the creature were enjoying her pain. It's too late, Emma. The voice echoed in her mind, but it wasn't the voice of the figure this time. It was the voice of one of the children, distorted, hollow, as though it had been twisted by the darkness of the woods. We were all like you once. Just like Timmy. You'll learn. You'll understand. The branches above her seemed to creak and groan, the forest alive with the faint whispers and cries that tugged at her very soul. Emma could hear the sorrow, the helplessness, the longing in each voice. These were the voices of children who had been trapped by the forest, their souls forever bound to it. They were trapped in the darkness, just like the others, lost, unreachable, begging for someone to hear them. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, but it was impossible. Every call, every whisper, felt like a hand reaching into her chest, grabbing at her heart, pulling her toward the deep, suffocating darkness of the forest. She could feel the weight of their pain, the endless agony of those who had never escaped. And it was all because of the creature that stood before her, the one that lured children with its flickering light and led them into the woods, only to devour their souls and trap them forever. You'll join them soon enough, Emma. The voice was back, smooth and cold, slipping into her thoughts like a shadow. They're waiting for you. We all are. You won't be alone anymore. You'll be one of us. Forever. Her knees shook beneath her, the ground feeling as though it was sinking under her feet. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the voices, those voices, were all around her, drowning her in a sea of anguish. Emma, come with us, one of the voices cried, sharp and pleading. We can't leave without you. Don't listen to them, a familiar voice whispered, Timmy's voice, but it was distant, strained, as though it was coming from a great distance. Please, Emma, don't become like me. Emma's breath hitched. She turned toward the sound of Timmy's voice, but the forest seemed to warp before her eyes, the trees shifting, twisting, as though the entire landscape was alive, moving with a sinister intent. She couldn't see him, couldn't find him. But his voice, his desperate, tortured voice, continued to echo in her mind. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Emma's heart raced. Had Timmy been taken? Had he been lost to the forest completely? She shook her head, trying to focus. She couldn't give in. She couldn't let herself become one of them. She had to fight. She had to find a way out before it was too late. But the voices of the lost children, kept calling. Every step she took deeper into the woods seemed to pull her further away from the world she knew, further away from everything she had ever loved. The trees pressed in tighter, their branches reaching toward her, like claws. Help us, Emma, the voices wailed, their cries rising higher and higher until they became a cacophony of agony. We're lost, we're never coming back. Emma staggered back, her hands reaching out for anything to hold on to. She had to shut out the voices. She had to block them out. But they were everywhere, swirling around her, filling the air with their tortured screams. No! The thought rang out in her mind, cutting through the chaos. She couldn't give in. She had to find a way to save Timmy, to break free from this nightmare. But the forest was growing darker. The branches were closing in. And the voices, they wouldn't stop. The figure's eyes glowed brightly in the distance, beckoning her forward, and Emma felt herself slipping closer to the shadows, closer to the forest's hunger. She had to resist. She had to find the strength. But with every voice, every whisper, every cry, Emma felt herself being drawn deeper into the forest, into the darkness, into the lost. The air grew colder. The whispers, once faint and distant, now seemed to press against Emma's ears, the voices of the lost children swelling into an unbearable din. She clutched her arms to her chest, trying to hold herself together, but the oppressive weight of the forest seemed to be crushing her, suffocating her with each passing second. Then, amid the noise, something else pierced the silence. Something that cut through the haze of despair like a knife. A laugh. It was faint at first, distant, but unmistakable. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She turned sharply toward the sound, her pulse quickening, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. It was Timmy. She was certain of it. His laugh echoed through the trees, high-pitched and playful, the kind of laugh she had heard 1,000 times before when they were children playing in the yard, running through the fields with wild abandon. But now, in the twisted dark of the forest, the laugh sounded wrong, distorted, unnatural, as if it were a mocking shadow of what it should have been. Emma's breath caught in her throat. No, this couldn't be happening. Timmy should be far ahead of her, still standing motionless by the creature, his eyes vacant. How could he be laughing? It didn't make sense. Timmy, she whispered, her voice trembling. She called out again, her voice cracking as she tried to reach him, to pull him back from wherever the forest had taken him. Timmy, where are you? But his laughter came again, closer this time, as if he were standing right behind her. She spun around, her eyes desperately searching the trees, but saw nothing. Just the dense, suffocating shadows, the twisted forms of the branches hanging low, their gnarled limbs blocking any hint of the moonlight. The laughter echoed again, so close, so real, yet empty. Emma stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Timmy's laughter was supposed to be comforting, sweet. But now, it felt as though it was taunting her, pulling her deeper into the heart of the woods. The forest was warping everything. The familiar sound of her brother's joy twisted into something darker, something sinister. "Come closer, Emma." The voice had changed again. This time, it wasn't the children's chorus, it wasn't the whispers from the trees. It was Timmy's voice. Faint, echoing through the darkness, as if he were calling her from a distance. "Timmy?" Emma choked, stepping forward, her feet moving against her will. Her legs trembled, every instinct screaming for her to turn and run, but the pull of his voice, the warmth of familiarity, even twisted and broken as it was, drew her forward. And then, she heard it again, the laugh. But this time, it was no longer just an echo. It was right beside her. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she turned slowly, eyes wide with terror. Timmy stood just a few paces away, but not the Timmy she remembered. His face was frozen in that same blank expression, his eyes wide and glassy, devoid of the spark of life that had once made them shine. Yet, his lips curled into a smile, unnaturally wide, too wide, revealing a row of teeth that seemed almost too sharp, too jagged. And then, his laugh. The laugh that should have been playful, that should have been innocent, came again, loud and mocking, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound like the laughter of her brother at all. It was something else, something twisted, something hollow. "Timmy," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, her body frozen in place. The creature, the thing that had once looked like a fairy, that had led them into the woods, was standing behind him, its form flickering like a broken light bulb. Its glowing wings rippled in the darkness, casting a sickly light over Timmy's distorted figure. The figure's eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger as it looked at Emma, its lips curling into a grin that mirrored Timmy's. "It's too late for him, Emma," the voice in her mind cooed, the words as smooth and sickly sweet as honey. "It's too late for both of you." Emma's knees buckled as she watched her brother, stand there, his laugh ringing through the forest like a bell tolling for her doom. His face twisted into something grotesque, his eyes staring blankly through her as if she were already lost to him, as if he were no longer himself. "Timmy!" Emma gasped again, her voice cracking, as tears began to well up in her eyes. Her brother's laughter, his distorted, eerie laughter, echoed once more, and Emma could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her. The trees were alive now, their branches clawing at the air, and the mist swirled around her feet like a living thing, suffocating, pulling her closer to the heart of the woods. Her mind screamed in protest, but there was no way to escape. The laughter was all-encompassing now, ringing in her ears, drowning out her thoughts, her screams. The creature's power was absolute, and Timmy had already fallen prey to it. The forest was devouring him, just as it had devoured all the others. And now, Emma realized with growing horror, she was next. She reached out toward her brother, but he didn't move. His laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, drawing closer, and then it stopped. In the silence that followed, Emma stood frozen, a cold chill running through her body as she felt the earth beneath her feet tremble. She could hear the rustling of the trees, the whispers growing louder, swirling around her, and in that moment, she realized it wasn't just Timmy who had laughed. It was the forest. And it was calling her, drawing her into its depths. The darkness was too thick to escape. The forest had claimed another. The glow of the figure intensified as it slowly moved toward Emma, its ethereal light flickering like a dying flame, casting unsettling shadows on the trees around her. The air seemed to grow colder still, the whispers of the lost children merging with the rustling of the branches above. Every step Emma took backward felt heavier, like invisible hands were pushing her deeper into the woods, urging her toward the figure that stood before her. She could feel its presence like a weight on her chest, its pull irresistible. She wanted to run, desperately, but the forest was closing in. The trees, once distant, now seemed to press in on her from all sides, their branches blocking any escape, trapping her in their twisted embrace. The figure, now unmistakable in its glow, moved forward, and Emma's heart pounded as she instinctively took a step back. But it was no use. The glow was growing brighter, more pronounced, as though it were feeding off her fear, reveling in the terror it caused. The faint flicker of its wings danced like flames, casting long, ghostly shadows on the ground, shifting with every movement. It wasn't just the light that caught Emma's attention. It was the way it moved, graceful and fluid, as though it were gliding effortlessly through the air. The creature was no longer a distant, faint silhouette, but a clear, glowing figure. Its wings fluttered like delicate fabric, but the glow that emanated from them was wrong. It pulsed, casting an eerie light on the forest floor, and with each beat, it seemed to draw Emma closer, as if it were waiting, watching, knowing that she was too afraid to resist. And that realization hit Emma like a punch to the gut. It had been waiting for her. The creature had always been waiting for her. The moment she stepped into the woods, it had been biding its time, drawing her closer with its soft whispers, the allure of its glowing form. Emma thought she had come to the woods out of curiosity, but she knew now that it was never her choice. The creature had planned this from the beginning. It had known she would follow Timmy, knew that she would feel the pull of the unknown and would come running into its grasp, just like all the others before her. The figure took another step toward her, its glow brighter now, its wings fluttering in slow, deliberate motions. The air around it shimmered, and the strange warmth that radiated seemed to cut through the chill of the woods, wrapping around Emma like a soft, suffocating blanket. She felt herself drawn to it, unable to break free from the pull of its light. "Come closer, Emma," the voice whispered, but this time it was not the voice of Timmy, nor the children lost to the forest. No, this voice was different. It was softer, more seductive, almost like a lullaby. "Join us." The voice continued, a soft murmur in the night. "It's safer here. It's better. You don't have to be afraid." Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she couldn't look away. Her feet seemed to move on their own accord, pulling her toward the figure despite the panic rising within her. Her thoughts screamed for her to stop, to run, but every part of her body seemed frozen, caught in the web of the creature's spell. The glow from the figure burned bright in the darkness, casting long shadows that flickered with unnatural movement. The trees around her seemed to sway in time with the creature's wings, their branches reaching out like claws, inviting her in. But then, something else flickered in her mind, a memory, faint and distant, like a forgotten dream. She remembered the stories her parents used to tell her, the old legends about the forest, the strange disappearances of children who had ventured too far into its depths. The forest wasn't just a place of trees, it was alive, a place that preyed on the innocent, drawing them in with the illusion of safety before it consumed them whole. This is it, Emma thought, a sickening realization taking root in her gut. It's not just a fairy. It's something worse. Something that feeds on children's souls. The figure's eyes locked with hers. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Emma could feel its gaze, like a weight on her mind. She wanted to scream, to tear herself away, but the more she fought, the more she felt herself being drawn in. Its wings fluttered one last time, and the world around her seemed to tilt, the trees spinning like the world had turned upside down. "Don't fight it," the voice whispered, the air thick with its power. "There's no need to be afraid. You belong here. We all belong here." A single step. That's all it took. One step closer, and Emma felt the air around her shift, the thick, suffocating fog that seemed to creep up from the ground, wrapping around her legs like tendrils. It was as though the forest itself was claiming her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The figure's wings seemed to pulse with an almost maddening rhythm, urging her forward, and she felt herself move with it, helplessly, unwillingly. And then, with one final, soft step, she was standing before it, the creature's glow enveloping her, its eerie light blinding. She felt herself shiver, a wave of cold running through her. For a moment, there was silence. The whispers, the cries of the lost children, the laughter, it all vanished, as though it were waiting for something. Something to happen. Something to break. "You're not alone, Emma." The voice was closer now, swirling around her like a thick fog, but not a single word was spoken aloud. "We are all here, waiting for you." The air was still. The trees seemed to be watching, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Emma could feel the pull intensify, an almost magnetic force drawing her closer to the figure's glowing form. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the fear, but it was no use. The woods had won. And she was theirs now, just like Timmy. Emma's heart raced as she stood frozen in the presence of the glowing figure, the weight of the forest pressing on her. The light from the creature flickered, casting erratic shadows across her face. The air around her felt thick, heavy with an unnatural silence that suffocated the night. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, trying to block out the fear gnawing at her insides. "This isn't real," she thought, desperate to convince herself. "This is just a dream. I'll wake up any second now, and everything will be fine." But no matter how tightly she squeezed her eyes shut, the terror persisted. The whispers in the woods were louder now, murmuring from all directions, their words incomprehensible but filled with a sinister undertone. The faintest hints of voices, lost children, perhaps, seemed to echo through the trees, but the longer she stood there, the more distant they became, as though they were retreating into the heart of the forest. Her feet felt heavy, like the ground beneath her was pulling her down, unwilling to let her go. She opened her eyes and saw the figure standing just a few feet in front of her, its glowing wings fluttering softly in the still air, casting a sickly light that distorted everything around her. "Timmy!" Emma shouted, her voice ragged, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the vast silence of the woods. She called again, her voice growing louder, more frantic. "Timmy, help me. Please." But there was no answer. No sound. Just the whispers, low and faint, swirling around her like an invisible storm. A cold dread gripped her chest as she realized that no one could hear her. She was alone. The isolation of the woods had swallowed her whole, and she could feel the creature watching her, its glowing eyes never leaving her. The silence felt like a presence in itself, suffocating, filling the space with an oppressive force that made it impossible to breathe, let alone think. "Help!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But the only response was the faint rustling of leaves and the unyielding hum of the whispers in the dark. She tried to turn, to run, to escape the creature's gaze, but the trees had shifted once more. Their branches seemed to close in, blocking every path she tried to take. The thick fog at her feet had risen, wrapping itself around her ankles like cold fingers, pulling her back toward the figure. Her body screamed for escape, but it was as if the very forest itself was holding her in place, tethering her to the spot. The figure stepped closer, its glowing wings casting long shadows that danced in the mist. The air around Emma grew colder, and she could feel the edges of her vision blur as the light from the creature flickered again. It was as if time itself had warped, the moments stretching out painfully long. "No, no," she whispered desperately, her voice trembling. She tried to back away, but her legs felt weak, as if they no longer belonged to her. She stumbled and caught herself against the twisted trunk of a nearby tree. Its bark was cold and rough against her skin, but it did nothing to steady her racing heart. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was speaking directly to her, urging her to stop fighting. She heard them now, clearer than before, the voices of the lost children, faint but desperate, calling out from somewhere deeper in the woods. Their cries were full of sorrow and longing, echoing through the trees, rising and falling like a mournful lullaby. "They're gone," she thought, choking on the bitter realization. They'd been lost to the forest, just like Timmy. And I'm going to be lost too. Her mind raced with thoughts of her brother, of the way his laugh had sounded when it echoed through the trees, mocking her like a taunt. Where was he now? Was he still out there, somewhere, just beyond her reach? Or had he already fallen to the creature's power, swallowed up by the forest's dark embrace? No. She couldn't think like that. She had to get out. She had to find a way. "Timmy," she cried again, her voice desperate, hoarse. "Please, Timmy, I need you." But still, there was no answer. No sound, except for the low rustle of the leaves and the haunting whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the forest. The woods were closing in, its power growing stronger with each passing second. And Emma realized, with rising horror, that the longer she stayed here, the more it would take from her. She tried once more to push through the trees, to fight her way out, but it was useless. Every direction she turned led to more twisted branches, more shadows that blocked her way. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her down, as if the very earth was swallowing her whole. The whispers grew louder still, the voices now indistinguishable from the wind that howled through the trees, and Emma felt the weight of their sorrow pressing on her chest. The creature, its glow now blinding, took another step forward, its wings fluttering slowly as it circled her, like a predator sizing up its prey. Its eyes, dark, bottomless, never left her, and for the first time, Emma felt the full weight of its presence. It wasn't just waiting for her, it was consuming her, feeding off her fear and desperation, slowly breaking her down. "No," Emma whispered again, her voice trembling. "I won't stay here. I won't." But the woods didn't listen. The trees creaked and groaned as the forest shifted, as if acknowledging her words. It was too late now. The forest had her. And as the figure moved closer, the whispers became deafening, filling her mind with the sorrow of the lost children, their voices now indistinguishable from her own panic-stricken thoughts. She could feel the forest closing in, its darkness pressing in around her. She was trapped. Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stumbled through the dense underbrush, her legs weak and trembling beneath her. The weight of the forest's oppressive silence pressed down on her, and she had to fight to keep her breath steady. The whispers, the calls, they were everywhere, twisting through the trees, whispering her name, coaxing her deeper. But she couldn't stop. She had to find Timmy. She couldn't leave him out there alone. She pushed through the dense thicket, her hands scraping against rough bark and brambles, every step dragging her further into the heart of the woods. She called his name again, her voice shaking but determined. "Timmy! Timmy, where are you?" Her heart skipped a beat when she heard a faint, distant sound, a laugh. It was a soft, eerie chuckle, one she recognized immediately. Timmy. But it wasn't the same. It was hollow. A strange, distant echo that sent a chill down her spine. "Timmy," she cried again, urgency rising in her voice as she pushed through the thick branches ahead. The forest felt different here. The air was heavier, thicker, and the trees seemed to lean in closer, almost as if they were watching her every move. The glow from the creature's wings flickered in the distance, like an unholy beacon guiding her forward, but she couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on finding Timmy. And then, she saw him. He was standing just a few yards away, beneath the twisted branches of an ancient oak. His small frame was still, his head tilted slightly to the side, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. The faint glow from the figure in the distance seemed to illuminate him, casting long shadows over his face, but his eyes were the most unsettling part. Timmy's once bright, curious eyes were now vacant, empty. There was no recognition in them. No spark of life. His pupils were wide, glassy, and unfocused, staring into nothingness as if he were seeing something beyond the world Emma knew. His face was eerily calm, and the playful, mischievous expression that had always been a part of him was gone, replaced by an unsettling blankness. "Timmy?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped forward, unsure whether she should approach him or run. "Timmy, it's me. It's Emma, your sister. Do you remember?" Timmy's head shifted ever so slightly, his vacant gaze turning toward her. But there was no recognition in his eyes. No flicker of joy at the sight of her. He didn't even smile. Instead, his lips parted, but the words that came out were wrong. "Join us," he whispered, his voice low and detached, almost like he was reading from a script. "It's better here. Don't be afraid." Emma's stomach twisted in horror as she took another hesitant step toward him. This wasn't Timmy. This wasn't her little brother. The warmth that had once been there, the life, was gone. He was standing before her like a hollow shell, his body here but his soul somewhere else. "Timmy, no! No, don't listen to it!" Emma cried, her heart breaking at the sight of her brother lost to the forest. "You have to come back. I'll take you home. I'll take you back to Mom and Dad." But Timmy didn't respond. He just stood there, his vacant gaze still locked on her, his body unmoving. He wasn't hearing her. He wasn't there. The creature, the fairy, or whatever it was, had taken him. Its power had consumed him, turning him into something different. Something empty. The whispers around her grew louder, the voices of the lost children blending into a single, maddening sound. "Join us. You belong here now." Emma shook her head, pushing the words out of her mind. She couldn't let herself fall to the same fate. She couldn't become like Timmy, lost, empty, controlled by whatever dark force ruled these woods. She had to get him back. She had to pull him from the edge before it was too late. Her voice broke as she reached out to him, her hands trembling. "Timmy, please, remember. Please, come back to me. You're my brother, and I won't leave you here." For a moment, it seemed as though Timmy might respond. His lips parted, and for just a second, Emma thought she saw something, just a flicker of recognition of the boy she knew behind those empty eyes. But then it was gone, replaced once again by that cold emptiness. "Join us," Timmy repeated, his voice now mechanical, as though it wasn't truly his own. "It's where you belong." Emma's heart sank. She felt the weight of the forest around her, closing in on her. The woods were feeding on Timmy, twisting him into something else. She had no idea how much longer she had before it would do the same to her. And then, something deep within her snapped. No. She wouldn't let this happen. She couldn't. Not to Timmy, and not to herself. No. Emma shouted, the fear in her voice giving way to something stronger, desperation. She rushed forward, grabbing Timmy by the shoulders and shaking him. "Snap out of it. Timmy, listen to me. You have to fight it, please." But his body was stiff, unresponsive. His head tilted to the side, his eyes still glassy, and he made no move to acknowledge her. He was completely gone, consumed by whatever evil force had claimed the woods. Emma's throat tightened as she realized the truth. There was nothing left of Timmy here. What stood before her was just an empty shell, a puppet controlled by something far more powerful than her. And the worst part? She knew she wasn't far behind. The creature was watching her, waiting for the right moment to claim her too. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She couldn't afford to break down now. She had to find a way to save Timmy, to save herself. But the forest had already started to claim her too. Emma's hands shook as she held Timmy, her grip tight on his shoulders, but he felt like stone beneath her touch, cold, unyielding. She could feel the air around her thickening, the oppressive weight of the forest closing in tighter with every passing second. The whispers were now more than just a noise. They were a pressure on her mind, pushing on her thoughts, drowning her in their darkness. She could hear the distant hum of the creature's presence, always just beyond her reach, but she knew that something more than fear was at play. The truth, the awful, inevitable truth, was finally sinking in. Timmy's head tilted again, his empty eyes still locked onto hers, but for the first time, he didn't speak. The hollow, mechanical words had stopped. Instead, a soft, echoing voice drifted out from the shadows, low, smooth, and chilling. "You've come closer than I expected." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a wave of icy terror through Emma. It was not Timmy. It was not the forest either. It was something else, something ancient and powerful. Emma slowly turned her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scanned the darkness around her. She couldn't see the creature clearly, only the shifting, flickering light of its wings in the distance. But then, from the very air around her, the figure emerged once more. It wasn't like before, a mere glowing light at the edge of her vision. Now, it was fully formed, hovering just in front of her. Its wings were wide, glowing with an unsettling light, but the beauty of its delicate form was shattered by the malice in its eyes, eyes that held centuries of hunger. It was a fairy, at least, it looked like one. But Emma's heart dropped as she realized this was no magical creature. This was something far darker. "I see you understand now," the creature said, its voice sweet but laced with an undercurrent of cold, ancient power. "You wonder what has become of your dear brother, don't you? Of all the children who wander these woods." Emma's throat tightened, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape, but the air was thick, like she was standing in a dream she couldn't wake from. The figure's wings flickered again, casting an eerie light on Timmy's vacant face, and Emma's heart shattered at the sight. Timmy has become mine, as all of them do, the fairy continued, its voice slipping into the stillness like a knife. You see, I am not just a creature of light. I am the guardian of these woods, and its feeder. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The truth hit her like a cold wave. The feeder, the thing that had been taking children, luring them into the forest, and making them disappear. The fairy's laugh was soft, almost pitying. It's very simple, you see. I feed off the souls of the lost, those who stray too far from the safety of their homes. Those who wander into the woods in search of something they can't explain. And once I have them, I use them. I bind their souls to this place, and they become part of my eternal court, my servants. Emma's mind reeled, trying to process the horror of it all. Timmy wasn't just lost, he was gone, his soul consumed, bound to serve the fairy for eternity, trapped in the woods forever. Her little brother, who had once been full of laughter and curiosity, was now just another shadow in this accursed place, a hollow shell of the boy he had been. The creature's eyes glinted with malice, and it stepped closer to Emma, its wings fluttering, causing the air around her to grow colder still. And now you are here, too. You feel the pull, don't you? You feel the call of the forest, the whispering voices, the desire to belong. To become one with the forest, to become one of us. Emma recoiled, the words hitting her like a slap. No, she thought fiercely. I won't fall to it. I won't join them. The fairy seemed to sense her resistance, and it smiled, a smile that didn't reach its eyes. Oh, but you already are, it whispered, its voice curling around her like a vine, tightening with each word. You're already mine in a way you can't comprehend. The forest speaks to you, just as it spoke to Timmy, just as it spoke to all the others. You think you're fighting it, but the truth is, you're drawn here, drawn to me, drawn to the soul of the forest, where no one ever truly leaves. Emma's mind was spinning, but beneath the terror, there was something else, a cold, dark truth she could no longer deny. She could feel it now, just beneath her skin, the same pull that had led Timmy away from her, the same pull that had drawn her deeper into the woods. I don't want this, Emma said, her voice breaking. She backed away from Timmy, who remained still, his vacant eyes still fixed on her, as though nothing of the brother she loved remained. The fairy tilted its head, a mocking glint in its eyes. It's not a choice, my dear. It never was. You are already part of the woods now. Just like Timmy and the others before him. You are mine, whether you accept it or not. The words burned into Emma's soul, but she refused to let them break her. She had to fight. She had to fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emma turned on her heel, her feet stumbling as she ran, ignoring the pull of the woods, the whispers growing louder in her ears, as if the forest itself was urging her to turn back. She could feel the fairy's gaze on her, the pull intensifying with every step she took, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. She had to save herself. She had to save Timmy. And if there was any hope left, it was slipping away fast. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a frantic reminder of the gravity of the moment. Her legs burned from running, and her breath came in shallow gasps, but still, she couldn't escape the suffocating pull of the forest. The branches twisted around her, as if the trees themselves were closing in, pushing her back, urging her to surrender. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, more desperate. And then, just as Emma thought she couldn't run anymore, the air around her stilled, and she froze. She had crossed into a clearing, but it wasn't the safety she had hoped for. The ground beneath her feet had become soft, like wet clay, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swirling around her. The fairy appeared before her, gliding effortlessly through the air, its wings shimmering with a spectral light. It looked more monstrous than ever in the moonlight, its delicate wings flickering, its eyes gleaming with hunger. Emma's pulse raced, but she forced herself to stand tall, her hands clenched into fists. She would not break. Not like Timmy. She wouldn't become another lost soul, bound to the forest's cruel will. The fairy's voice broke the silence, cool and calm, as though they were merely discussing an ordinary matter. "You don't have to keep running, Emma," it said, its words wrapping around her like velvet. "The woods are vast, but I am patient. I can give you everything you desire: safety, peace, a place to belong. You need only choose." Emma took a shaky step back, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" "What choice?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The fairy's smile was cold, distant, its eyes never leaving hers. "Join us," it said softly, its voice coaxing, sweet as honey. "Become part of my court, serve me for eternity, and I will ensure you never feel lonely again. You will live forever in this eternal forest, surrounded by others like you. No pain, no fear. Just peace." Or, it paused, as though savoring the moment. "Or," it continued, "you can keep running. Keep fighting the inevitable. But know this, Emma, no one who enters these woods ever leaves. Not truly. I will never let you go. Not unless you choose to join me, to give yourself willingly." The whispering voices in the woods grew louder, echoing with a chorus of children's laughter, distant and hollow. Emma's eyes darted around her, her mind scrambling for any rational thought. She could feel it, the lure of the forest, like a heavy weight on her chest. The pull was growing stronger, trying to bind her to this place, to its twisted, eternal servitude. Her gaze flicked back to Timmy, who stood motionless in the clearing. His eyes were empty, but the faintest trace of a smile tugged at his lips, an unnatural, eerie smile that made her skin crawl. Emma clenched her fists even harder, her nails digging into her palms. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I won't join you. I'll never join you." The fairy's smile faltered for just a moment, its wings flickering in the dim light. But then it straightened, as if it had expected her answer. The coldness in its eyes deepened. "You misunderstand, Emma," it said, its voice no longer soothing but full of dark amusement. "This isn't about choice. It's about what you are, what you will become. You are mine now, whether you accept it or not." Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes as the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees groaned, their limbs stretching toward her, as though reaching for her very soul. She could feel the cold fingers of the woods pressing against her mind, pulling her closer to the edge of despair. The fairy circled around her, its glow casting an eerie light across her face. "You will not leave. You will never leave, Emma. The forest will claim you, just as it claimed all those before you. Your brother is only the first. You can try to resist, but in the end, you'll see. You'll see that the woods never let go." Emma's breath quickened, her heart hammering in her chest. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against a cliff. There was no escape. Not by running, not by fighting. The fairy's words were more than just empty threats, they were the truth. Timmy's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Emma saw something human, within them. A fleeting glimmer of recognition of who he once was. It was enough to break her heart. The fairy's voice cut through her thoughts, its tone softening once more. You're not alone, Emma. Don't you see? We're all waiting for you. All of us who came before you. Together, forever. Emma stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself be swallowed by the woods, by the fairy's insidious grip. I don't belong to you, she said through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with defiance. I won't become part of this place. I'll fight you until my last breath. The fairy's laugh echoed around her, hollow and cruel, and for a moment Emma thought she could hear the voices of the lost children, their wails of despair mingling with the laughter, a terrible choir of souls trapped forever. The fairy circled closer, its eyes never leaving hers. You can fight, Emma. But in the end, it won't matter. You will join us, just like the others. And when you do, you'll understand. You'll finally understand the peace we offer. Emma's chest tightened. The weight of the forest was bearing down on her, and despite her words, she could feel herself starting to waver. The pull was unbearable now, closer than ever, sinking deep into her heart. But she couldn't give in. Not yet. She would fight. She had to. For herself. For Timmy. But as the fairy stepped closer, Emma realized that no matter how much she fought, there was one truth she couldn't escape: the forest never let go. As the fairy glided closer, Emma felt a shift in the air, as if the very atmosphere was thickening around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and each inhale felt heavier, like she was drawing in the very essence of the forest itself. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled her nose, but it was different now, foul, as if the air itself had become tainted with something ancient and suffocating. Her legs shook beneath her, the weight of the forest pressing down on her chest, making each step harder to take. It wasn't just the fairy anymore. The woods themselves were turning against her, shifting in ways she couldn't understand. The trees loomed higher now, their branches tangling and twisting, blocking out the moonlight. The once familiar landscape had become an alien world, one where she no longer had any control. The whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices swirling in her mind, drowning out her thoughts. You can't escape, they murmured, a chorus of lost souls. We're waiting. You belong to us. Emma staggered backward, trying to break free, but her feet sank deeper into the earth. The ground felt soft and spongy, as if it were absorbing her, pulling her down into the very heart of the forest. Panic surged through her veins, and she fought to move, but her body felt heavier with every passing second. She was losing strength, as though the woods were draining her, siphoning away her will to resist. Her eyes darted around desperately, searching for a way out, but there was nothing, only the oppressive shadows and the glowing figure of the fairy, drawing nearer with every step. The pull of the forest was undeniable now. It was in the air, in the trees, in the very soil beneath her feet. It was in her bones, seeping into her thoughts, making her forget who she was, what she was fighting for. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her words seemed to vanish before they even left her mouth, swallowed by the forest's deafening silence. The fairy was so close now that she could feel its presence pressing on her like a weight. Its glow was no longer just light, it was warmth, a warmth that threatened to burn her skin, to consume her whole. You will stay, the fairy whispered, its voice a soothing melody, almost gentle now, as though it were comforting her. You will give in. The woods will claim you, just as they claimed Timmy. All who enter these woods are mine. You are mine. Timmy's vacant eyes locked onto hers from where he stood in the clearing, a strange smile tugging at his lips. Emma wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. It was as though she had forgotten how to speak, how to fight. Her mind clouded with exhaustion, and she stumbled forward toward the fairy, as if she were drawn by an invisible force, her feet no longer her own. Her body felt weightless, as though her very soul was slipping from her, like sand sifting through her fingers. The ground beneath her had become soft and treacherous, pulling at her with every step, as if the earth itself were trying to swallow her whole. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches stretching like twisted fingers, closing in on her from every direction. "No," Emma whispered, but even her voice sounded distant, as though someone else were speaking the words. I won't let you take me." But it was no use. The fairy's glow intensified, and Emma could feel herself being drawn toward it, toward the embrace of the forest, as if the very earth were rooting her in place. The air around her seemed to thicken, wrapping her in a fog, clouding her thoughts, dulling her senses. The pain of resistance was unbearable, each part of her body aching as the forest's hold on her tightened. Timmy's voice, his laughter, echoed through the trees again, high-pitched and distant, but strangely comforting. "It's not so bad, Emma," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "You'll see. We're all here. You're never alone." Emma's heart twisted in her chest. She had to fight. She had to fight for Timmy, for herself. But every thought was slipping through her mind like water through a sieve. The more she fought, the harder it became to hold onto her sense of self. The trees whispered louder now, their voices curling into her ears, soothing her, urging her to give in. "It's too late to fight," the fairy murmured, its voice echoing through her mind, a twisted lullaby. "You've already been chosen." And in that moment, Emma felt it, her body, her very soul, slipping away. The forest had claimed her, and she could no longer escape. The woods had won. Emma's heart was racing as she snapped back to full awareness, her mind fighting through the haze of the forest's oppressive grip. The air was thick, each breath a labor, but something inside her refused to surrender completely. She couldn't let the woods win. Not like this. Her legs trembled as she spun on her heel, her body driven by a primal urge to escape. The trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, seemed to close in on her as if they had been waiting for this moment. She pushed herself forward, desperate to move, her hands pushing through the air in front of her to break free from the encroaching darkness. But the forest had other plans. With every step, the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The soil was soft and spongy, like it was made of moss, sucking at her shoes, pulling at her ankles, threatening to drag her down. The forest itself felt alive, its heartbeat pulsing through the earth, and as she moved, the branches above her twisted and writhed, their sharp tips reaching down toward her like skeletal hands trying to snatch her back. Her breath hitched in panic as she realized she was being corralled. The trees weren't just growing closer, they were shifting, moving, closing in from every angle, cutting off every path she tried to take. The air grew colder with every step, and the sound of rustling leaves turned into something else, something almost like a whisper, but not human. A low, hissing murmur filled the silence around her. "You cannot leave," the voice echoed in her mind, cold and distant, yet unmistakable. It was the fairy. Its voice wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, filling her head, pushing against her thoughts. "You belong to the woods. You will stay." The branches in front of her twisted faster, curling like serpents, lashing out at her. Emma gasped as one caught her wrist, pulling her backward with an iron grip. Her feet left the ground, and she screamed, struggling against the rough bark that held her captive. The pain was sharp, the feeling of being bound by something unnatural tightening around her chest. She yanked her arm with all her strength, the force of the movement sending a tremor through the forest, but the branch refused to release her. Her mind screamed in terror, but her body felt too weak, too drained to break free. The glow of the fairy shimmered ahead, growing brighter, more insistent, urging her toward it. "You can't outrun the forest, Emma," the fairy whispered, its voice like silk and ice at the same time. "You are already mine. The woods have chosen." Emma's heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't let herself succumb to the pull. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way to break free. With one final, desperate cry, she yanked her arm again, her nails scraping against the rough bark of the branch, and finally, it released her. She stumbled backward, breathless, her heart pounding in her throat. But the victory was short-lived. As soon as she pulled free, the forest seemed to take a step forward. The ground beneath her feet buckled, and the trees leaned in, their trunks creaking and groaning as if alive, pushing her back, forcing her deeper into the maze of roots and shadows. The fairy's laughter filled the air, soft but filled with mockery. "You think you can run, Emma?" it whispered. "You think you can escape? You cannot escape what has already claimed you." Emma's pulse raced, but she refused to give in. She glanced frantically to either side. The trees had surrounded her, and she was trapped. The whispering was growing louder, more insistent, and the air around her felt heavy, like it was thick with the weight of 1,000 lost souls. But then something shifted. A strange, low rumble sounded deep within the forest, shaking the earth beneath her feet. For the briefest moment, the oppressive pressure of the trees seemed to ease, as though they were momentarily distracted. Emma seized the opportunity. She turned and sprinted, every fiber of her being urging her to run faster, to get away, to escape. Branches lashed out at her, but she ducked and weaved, pushing through the dense foliage, her breath ragged, her legs burning with effort. The whispers behind her became frantic, like the forest itself was pleading for her to stop, to return, to surrender. But Emma didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The forest was relentless, but so was she. The trees groaned as they bent toward her, their gnarled limbs reaching out, but Emma dashed through them, dodging their outstretched arms. Her feet were sore, but she kept running, her mind focused on the only thing that mattered now, escape. Ahead, through the trees, she thought she saw a break in the forest, a sliver of moonlight, the outline of open sky beyond the endless stretch of woods. Hope surged through her veins as she pushed forward, the sounds of the forest whispers fading into the background. But just as she thought she might make it, the ground beneath her feet shifted again, and she felt herself stumbling. A root, slick and twisting, shot out from the earth, tangling around her ankle and sending her crashing to the ground. The pain shot up her leg, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to move. She pushed herself up with all her strength, but before she could take another step, she felt the cold touch of something gentle but unyielding, like a hand wrapping around her heart, squeezing the life from her. The fairy's voice echoed again, this time in her ear, so close she could feel its icy breath on her skin. "It's over, Emma." The world around her blurred as the forest closed in, suffocating her every escape, swallowing her whole. The woods had claimed her. And this time, there was no escape. The deeper Emma stumbled into the forest, the more the world around her seemed to transform, distorting into something both beautiful and nightmarish. The trees, once dark and oppressive, now appeared as twisted, ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching high into the sky like arms desperately trying to grasp the heavens. The moonlight, filtering through the dense canopy, cast an eerie glow that shimmered on the edges of the leaves, turning them into silver filigree, as though the forest itself was alive with some otherworldly magic. But as beautiful as it was, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air felt thick with anticipation, buzzing with a strange energy, as though the forest was holding its breath. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, its rhythm a quiet, unsettling thrum. The whispers in the air had grown louder, more distinct, weaving in and out of her thoughts, drawing her deeper into the heart of the woods. "You're almost there, Emma," the voice of the fairy whispered, its tone a soft, melodic hum, yet with an underlying edge of malice. "Can you feel it? The pull?" Emma didn't want to feel it. She didn't want to be drawn in. But her body seemed to betray her, moving of its own accord, her feet dragging her deeper into the forest despite her will to stop. The farther she walked, the more surreal the forest became. Faint, glowing lights danced between the trees, drifting lazily through the air like will-o'-the-wisps. Their soft, pulsating glow beckoned her forward, and for a moment Emma felt the overwhelming urge to reach out and touch them, to be consumed by their gentle, flickering light. But a voice, her own, somewhere deep inside, screamed at her to stop. She wasn't sure why. Was it the beauty? The mystery? Or something darker, hidden behind the shimmering lights? "Stay close, Emma." The fairy's voice, now echoing all around her, vibrated in the air as if it were coming from the very trees themselves. "You're safe here. Come closer. Join us." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She tried to fight the pull, to tear herself away from the entrancing lights, but it was like trying to fight the tide. The woods were alive, and they wanted her. The earth beneath her feet seemed to shift, pushing her forward with an almost tender insistence. The roots of the trees twined around her legs, their bark soft yet unyielding, urging her onward. As she moved deeper into the forest, she noticed something even more unsettling. The forest floor itself seemed alive, moving with faint whispers. The leaves, soft and rustling underfoot, made noises that shouldn't be possible. Beneath the surface of the earth, something stirred, tiny, slithering creatures, their movements sending ripples through the moss-covered ground. And then, just as she thought the forest couldn't get any stranger, she saw them. Figures. Strange, glowing shapes flickering between the trees, as if the very light of the forest had come to life. They were like shadows and light at once, their forms too elusive to catch fully in her gaze, yet their presence unmistakable. There were shapes that moved in the corner of her vision, shifting in ways that defied logic, always just out of reach, just beyond the edge of her awareness. They seemed to smile at her, their ghostly features glowing in the darkness. The lights from earlier grew brighter, swirling around her, their movements so hypnotic, so mesmerizing, that Emma had to close her eyes to stop herself from being drawn in. The whispers around her had become a cacophony, rising and falling in an eerie chorus, like voices from another time, calling her name, urging her to surrender. "Come closer," the fairy whispered again, its voice soft, coaxing, like a lover's invitation. "The woods are so beautiful, so peaceful. They want you." Emma staggered, her hands clutching at the air, trying to steady herself, but the pressure of the forest, its invisible hands, was overwhelming. The trees seemed to bend toward her, their branches lowering as though reaching to wrap around her, to draw her into their embrace. The lights shimmered around her, drawing ever closer, until she felt surrounded on all sides by the strange, glowing figures. She could no longer tell what was real and what was an illusion. The beauty of the forest, the light, the whispers, they all blended into a surreal nightmare, a dream she couldn't escape. A feeling washed over her, an almost overwhelming sense of longing. "Just give in," the voice said. "Feel the peace. Let the forest take you." But deep down, Emma knew that peace was a lie. This beauty, this tranquility, it was all a trap. The forest was not a place of rest, it was a place of imprisonment, where souls were lured into servitude, where children became part of the woods, lost to time. Emma wasn't meant to stay here, to join them. She was meant to escape, to warn others, to fight. "No," she shouted, her voice hoarse, fighting against the enchantment pulling her in. "I won't give in." But even as the words left her mouth, she felt the weight of the woods around her, pressing down on her, closing in. The lights twinkled in the distance like 1,000 false stars, and the trees, too, seemed to hum with life, with purpose, as though they were alive and aware of her every move. She had to fight. But even as she thought it, the strange beauty of the forest, the eerie allure of the lights, the voices, the whispers, wrapped tighter around her, threatening to break her will, to make her believe she was one with the woods. She had no choice but to keep going. And yet, deep down, she knew it was already too late. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she moved deeper into the surreal forest. The lights around her grew brighter, blinding her for a moment, before they faded again into the misty gloom of the trees. She tried to focus, to regain her bearings, but something felt wrong, more wrong than she could explain. The shadows between the trees seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing, becoming something far more solid, far more real. As she took another hesitant step forward, something shifted in the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was another illusion, a trick of the forest, a mirage, a flicker of light, but then she saw it again, clearer this time. Children. They were standing just beyond the reach of the glowing lights, their figures half obscured by the dark underbrush, but their eyes, Emma would never forget the eyes. Hollow. Empty. Lifeless. The children didn't move, not at first. They just stood there, watching her. Their faces were twisted in unnatural ways, as though time had stretched and pulled them, bending their features into grotesque shapes. Their bodies were gaunt, their limbs unnaturally thin, almost as if they had been drained of something vital, something essential. The soft, eerie glow from the forest cast faint light on their pale faces, their eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling sheen. Emma's heart raced as her feet faltered, unsure if she should move closer or turn and run. She recognized them, some of them. There were faces she had seen before, children who had disappeared from the nearby town, children she had once known. The thought chilled her to the bone. Had they been lost in these very woods? Were they here now? Timmy? Her voice cracked as she called his name, though she feared it might be futile. She could barely keep her voice steady. The children didn't respond. They just stared at her, their gazes locked onto hers, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to understand. One of the figures took a step forward. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by strings. Its face was a mask of nothingness, no expression, no emotion, just an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone, her feet frozen to the ground by an invisible force. She felt their eyes upon her, hearing their silent, accusing presence all around her. And then, just as she began to turn, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of their gaze, a voice broke through the silence. "Come play with us." The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it sounded so real, so close. It echoed in her ears, reverberating from all sides. It was the voice of a child. But there was something wrong about it. The words were too sweet, too inviting. They were coated in a thin veneer of sugar, yet underneath, Emma could hear the bitterness, the sorrow, the torment. The figure that had stepped forward raised its arms, unnaturally long, and gestured toward her, as if beckoning her to come closer. As it moved, Emma saw that its skin was cracked, dry, as though it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. The figure's movements were slow and deliberate, yet there was a strange energy to them, like a clock winding down, the tension building with every step. Emma could hear the whispering growing louder, the voices of the lost children blending together in a cacophony of longing, of despair. "Come play with us, Emma," the voice repeated, more urgently this time, a thin, mocking lilt creeping into it. Emma's blood ran cold. The children were lost, their souls trapped within the forest, twisted by the fairy's cruel magic. They had been waiting for someone like her, someone who would come close enough, someone who might fall victim to the same fate. Emma tried to move, tried to escape, but the forest wouldn't let her. The branches, now like long fingers, seemed to reach for her, blocking her way. The ground beneath her feet felt as though it were sinking, the earth pulling her down, deeper into the dark embrace of the forest. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in the quiet, like a drumbeat marking the beginning of something terrible. The children continued to stare at her, their hollow eyes unblinking. They didn't speak anymore. They didn't need to. The message was clear. "You belong here now," the words hung in the air, thick with dread. "You will be one of us. Forever." A cold chill crept down Emma's spine as the full weight of the forest's power pressed down on her. The children, once innocent, were now trapped souls, their forms twisted and decayed by the fairy's cruel hold. And if she didn't leave now, if she didn't find a way to escape, she would join them. Forever lost in the woods, her body a hollow shell, her soul an echo in the darkness. Emma's breath quickened. She couldn't let that happen. She had to fight. Emma's heart raced as she stood in the shadow of the ghostly children. Her mind swirled with panic and fear, the air around her thick with the whispering voices that seemed to press in from all sides. The eerie glow of the forest, the twisted figures of the children, the unrelenting pull of the fairy, everything was conspiring to drag her into this nightmare. But something inside Emma refused to give in. A flicker of clarity shone through the terror, a memory of something distant, something real. The warmth of sunlight on her face. The sound of her mother's laughter. The smell of freshly baked bread walking through the house. These simple, comforting memories felt like lifelines in the darkness, something to hold on to when everything else seemed to slip away. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, pushing back the swirling fog that clouded her thoughts. "I can't lose myself here," she told herself, desperately grasping onto the threads of the world she once knew. "I am not one of them. I am not lost. I will not stay." The forest was relentless, its grip tightening with every passing second. The children, their hollow eyes trained on her, had become more than mere observers. They were a warning. They were the past, the ones who hadn't been strong enough to resist, the ones who had vanished into the forest, never to return. If she wasn't careful, she would be like them, her spirit consumed, her memories erased, her soul bound to this place forever. But Emma couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't become another lost child, wandering these cursed woods, trapped in endless servitude. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her racing pulse. She focused on the memories, the warmth of the sun, the feel of her family's arms around her. The laughter that filled the air on warm summer nights. They were still there, outside the woods. They were waiting for her. "Think, Emma," she urged herself. What's real? What can I hold on to? Suddenly, an idea sparked in her mind. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was younger. Stories about the forest, about the ancient creatures that lived within it, about how they fed off of fear and confusion, but they could be tricked if you held on to something pure. A memory, a symbol of love, of light, something that could counter the dark forces that bound this place. She reached into her pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out a small silver pendant her mother had given her when she was a child. It was simple, just a small charm in the shape of a heart, worn from years of use, but to Emma, it meant everything. It was a piece of her home, a piece of her past. Her fingers closed tightly around it, and she closed her eyes, focusing all her will on the small, comforting presence of the charm. The whispers grew louder, the forest seemed to close in around her, but Emma gripped the pendant tighter, forcing her mind to focus on the memories of her family, of the world beyond the forest, of everything she had left to lose. She thought of her mother's warm embrace, of her father's reassuring voice, of Timmy's laugh echoing through their house. They're still out there, Emma thought. I am not alone. I can find a way out. I am not lost. As she focused, she felt the pull of the woods weakening, just a little at first, but enough to give her hope. The branches that had once seemed to reach for her, to hold her down, now felt less oppressive, less suffocating. The voices of the children, too, started to fade, their calls growing quieter, more distant. The fairy's presence, once overwhelming, now felt less certain, as though her grip on Emma was slipping. But it wasn't enough yet. She still had to escape. Emma took a step forward, still holding the pendant tightly in her palm, and then another. The whispers rose again, sharp and insistent, as though the forest was trying to drag her back into its grip, but Emma didn't falter. She focused harder, imagining the light of the sun, the open fields of the farm, the feel of soft grass beneath her feet. She imagined her home, the sound of the wind, the taste of fresh air, things that could not exist in this dark, twisted place. Her feet moved faster now, her determination fueling her every step. The glowing lights of the forest flickered around her, still beckoning, still trying to pull her in, but Emma refused to be swayed. She felt a new strength rising within her, a force of will, something pure and unbreakable that pushed the fairy's influence back. I'm almost there, she thought. I can make it out of here. But just as she felt the first real taste of freedom, a voice, cold, sharp, and venomous, cut through the air, freezing her in place. You cannot leave. The fairy's voice was like a whip, sharp and commanding. You belong to the forest now, Emma. You will never escape. Emma's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let fear take control. She had come this far. She had fought too hard to give up now. She clenched her fist around the pendant one last time, a silent promise to herself that she would not succumb to the fairy's power. The forest seemed to roar in anger, the trees shaking, the ground beneath her feet trembling. But Emma didn't stop. She pushed forward, step by painful step, her body aching but her resolve unshaken. She could hear the children now, their voices a chorus of desperate pleas, their words distant but growing louder, pulling her back. But Emma didn't listen. She had something stronger now, a memory, a purpose, a life waiting for her outside the forest. She was not like them. She would never be like them. With one final burst of strength, Emma broke through the last of the twisting branches, stumbling into the open field beyond. The moment her feet hit the soft grass, the pressure lifted. The whispers ceased. The pull of the woods faded away. The air was still, cool, and fresh, and Emma took in a deep breath, the scent of the earth grounding her, reminding her of everything she had fought to protect. She had escaped. But as she stood there, panting, heart racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had not given up on her. It was still there, just beyond the trees, waiting. And Emma knew that as long as the fairy remained, as long as the forest existed, there would always be something lurking in the shadows, something that wanted to take her back. But for now, she was free. For now. The wind howled through the trees as Emma stood at the edge of the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest that had once seemed like a place of wonder now loomed before her like a dark, hungry beast. And in its depths, the fairy waited, patient, cruel, and ready to claim what it had been hunting for so long. Emma's eyes locked on the figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was not the glowing, ethereal being she had seen at first. No, this was something else, something darker, more insidious. The fairy's wings flickered like a broken lantern, casting long shadows on the ground, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. Behind it, the woods seemed to stretch into infinity, a tangled maze of dark branches and whispered voices. And then there was Timmy. Her brother was standing next to the fairy, his eyes dull and lifeless, his face vacant. He didn't look like the boy she had known. He looked empty. He didn't even seem to notice her standing there, his focus entirely on the creature before him. The fairy's hand rested on Timmy's shoulder, possessive and cold, and Emma's heart twisted at the sight. "Timmy," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "Timmy, look at me. It's me, your sister. Please, wake up." But Timmy didn't respond. His lips curled into an eerie smile, but his eyes remained distant, blank. The fairy's influence was complete. Timmy was lost to her now, a puppet under her control. Emma's stomach churned with horror. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been trying to fight for herself, for her survival, but now she was fighting for Timmy too. And the more she looked at him, the more she could see the change in him, the subtle shift that had taken place while she had been too focused on escaping herself. He had given in. He had become one of them. A cold, cruel laugh echoed from the fairy's mouth, a sound like the rustle of dry leaves. "You think you can save him?" the fairy taunted, its voice a haunting melody. "He is mine now, just as you will be, soon enough." The fairy's words struck deep, sinking into Emma's chest like icy daggers. "No," she whispered fiercely to herself. "I will not let you take him. I won't lose him." Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to control her fear. She couldn't let the fairy see her break. She had to be strong, for Timmy, for herself. Slowly, she took a step forward, her feet crunching on the leaves. The fairy's eyes flicked toward her, glowing like twin flames, but Emma didn't stop. Her breath was shallow, but she pushed through, forcing herself to close the distance between them. "Timmy," she called again, her voice trembling, but full of determination. "Please, come back to me. You're not like them. You're my brother." For a moment, there was a flicker in Timmy's eyes, a brief spark of recognition. Emma's heart leapt, but it was quickly extinguished as the fairy's grip on him tightened. He stepped back, away from her, his expression blank once more. "You cannot save him," the fairy hissed, stepping forward as well, its glowing wings casting an eerie light on the ground. "He belongs to me now. Just as you will." The fairy's power washed over Emma, suffocating and overwhelming. She could feel the dark presence wrapping around her like a vice, the weight of it pressing in on her chest. The whispers of the lost children filled her ears, and she had to fight to keep her thoughts clear. "No," she screamed as the pressure built. "I won't join you. I won't become one of them." With a final, desperate burst of strength, Emma reached out, not to the fairy, but to Timmy. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward her. But he didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. "Timmy, please," Emma begged, shaking him. "You're still in there. You have to fight." For a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was immediately smothered by the fairy's dark influence. He tore his arm away from her, his voice distant, cold. "You don't understand, Emma," Timmy said, his voice flat. "I'm not who I was anymore. I'm part of her now. I can't go back." Emma's heart shattered. She knew then that he was lost. The boy who had once been her brother was gone, replaced by something twisted and hollow. The fairy had won. The fairy laughed again, the sound like the crackle of dry leaves in a dying autumn breeze. "It's over, Emma. There is no escape. You're already a part of me, just as your brother is." But Emma didn't give up. She couldn't. Even in the face of hopelessness, she refused to surrender to the darkness. Her hands shook as she gripped the pendant that had been with her since the beginning, the small, silver heart that had carried her through so many moments of fear and doubt. She held it up, her eyes locked on the fairy's glowing form. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with defiance. "I'm not like you. I'm not lost." The fairy recoiled, the glow of its wings flickering as if threatened by Emma's refusal to submit. Its expression twisted in anger, but Emma didn't falter. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. With a final, defiant shout, Emma flung the pendant forward, a single, shining tear falling from her eye. The pendant flew through the air, its light shining brightly, and in that moment, something shifted. The darkness in the woods began to waver, the forest groaning as if something ancient and powerful was being disturbed. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The fairy screeched, its form breaking apart, its wings flickering and then dissolving into nothingness. The trees groaned as they began to shift, their branches loosening, the oppressive weight of the forest starting to lift. Emma blinked, disoriented, as the world around her began to return to normal. The children, once twisted and hollow, faded from sight, their voices silenced. The eerie glow of the forest dimmed. She turned to Timmy, who was standing there, staring at her with wide eyes. For a moment, he didn't speak, but then he blinked, his expression softening, and he finally whispered, "Emma?" She ran to him, her heart swelling with relief, and pulled him into a tight hug. The weight of the woods, the horror, the darkness, they were all gone. The fairy's grip on him had been broken. But as Emma stood there, holding Timmy, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, waiting, and that there would always be a piece of the darkness that lingered just beyond the trees. For now, though, they were free. And Emma vowed never to forget that the shadows of the woods would always be lurking, ready to claim anyone who ventured too far into the heart of the forest. The world around Emma began to distort, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the woods, the chirping insects, the rustling leaves, had vanished, replaced by an unnatural stillness. It felt as though time had stopped, or perhaps it was just the world warping under the fairy's power. The trees closed in tighter, their branches thick with shadows, twisting into grotesque shapes, like gnarled fingers reaching out to grab her. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to take a step back, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her further into the darkened depths of the forest. It was as if the very earth had become a part of the fairy's trap, its power rising like a tide, relentless and suffocating. "You cannot escape," the fairy whispered, its voice soft but menacing. Its figure flickered in and out of focus, like a flame struggling to stay alight. "The forest is mine. You are mine." Emma turned sharply, trying to find a way out, but the path that had once seemed clear was now a tangled maze of trees, each one looming like a silent sentinel. The whispering winds seemed to speak her name, coaxing her to step deeper, to give in. The forest had become an extension of the fairy, alive and aware, watching her every move. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward, fighting to keep her mind sharp. She couldn't afford to fall into the panic that was threatening to rise. "I won't be your prisoner," Emma spat, her voice shaking with defiance. "You can't control me." The fairy laughed, a low, cold sound that sent chills crawling down Emma's spine. "It's not about control, child. It's about survival. In this place, there are only two choices: join us, or be consumed. You see, Emma, the forest doesn't let go. Not once it has claimed you." With that, the forest seemed to respond. The trees groaned as their roots shifted beneath the ground, like the earth itself was closing in on her. Emma tried to move, but her feet felt heavy, as if the very ground was pulling her down. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to breathe, to think. She couldn't let the fairy take control of her, not now. She fought against the pull of the earth, her steps slow and labored as she dragged herself forward. But the deeper she ventured, the darker it became. The glow of the fairy's wings flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows around her. The whispers that had been faint now grew louder, filling the air with distorted voices, children's voices, twisted and pleading, calling her to join them. Emma's skin crawled as she realized the truth. The forest had been feeding off the souls of children for years, and now it was her turn. The fairy had been waiting for her to make the mistake of wandering too deep, and now it was too late. There was no way out. But Emma wasn't going to give in. Not without a fight. "Timmy," she screamed, her voice breaking through the whispers of the forest. "Timmy, if you can hear me, please, wake up." For a moment, there was silence. The forest seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Emma's heart raced as she scanned the shadows, desperately searching for her brother's face. She had to save him. She couldn't leave him here, lost in the forest, consumed by the fairy's power. And then, she saw him. Timmy stood in the distance, his eyes wide and glassy, his posture stiff. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, a mere shell of the boy he used to be. "Timmy!" Emma shouted again, her voice cracking. "Timmy, please, listen to me. I won't leave you here. We can still escape." But Timmy didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the fairy, his face empty, as though he didn't even hear her. The fairy, however, smiled, its eyes glowing brighter as it stepped toward Emma. "You see, child," it said, its voice a cruel murmur, "it's too late. He's mine now. And soon, you will be too." Emma's stomach twisted with horror as she watched Timmy, her brother, a hollow shell, now completely under the fairy's control. Her hands clenched into fists, the desperate need to save him surging within her. But the more she struggled, the more the forest seemed to close in. It was as if it was alive, an extension of the fairy's will, its roots and branches twisting to trap her. Her breath came faster, the weight of the forest pressing in on her. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way to break free from this nightmare, to save Timmy. But the more she fought, the weaker she felt. And then, she saw something. A small crack in the forest, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a chance. With all the strength she had left, Emma pushed herself forward, moving toward the crack in the darkness. The forest groaned in protest, its branches lashing out, trying to hold her back. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. "Timmy," she shouted one last time, her voice full of desperation. "You're stronger than this. Come back to me." But her brother didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the fairy, as the creature's laughter filled the air. Emma's pulse raced as she reached the edge of the crack in the trees. She could feel the fairy's power growing stronger, could hear the voices of the lost children urging her to give in, to stop fighting. But she refused. She refused to let the forest claim her, to let the fairy win. With one final, defiant push, Emma leapt through the crack, the trees reaching for her, but she was free. For now. As she tumbled into the clearing beyond the woods, the forest roared behind her. The fairy's laughter echoed, but Emma didn't turn back. She knew the price of survival, and she had paid it. But she also knew one thing: the forest was still there, waiting. And the fairy would never let her go. The darkness had only just begun. The world around Emma twisted and groaned like it was alive. She could feel it, the pulse of the forest, its heartbeat thudding in her chest as the fairy's presence loomed closer, its power saturating the very air she breathed. The trees, once just towering giants in the distance, now seemed to bend and stretch toward her like twisted fingers, reaching for her with an insatiable hunger. The fairy's voice whispered in the air, a haunting, almost hypnotic tone that made Emma's skin crawl. "You still don't understand, do you?" it said. "To escape, you must give something up. The woods take what they want, and in return, you are freed. But there is always a price. Always." Her heart raced, and for a moment, she stood frozen, torn between the nightmare closing in around her and the desperate need to find a way out. She had tried to fight. She had tried to resist. But now, the fairy's words began to sink in. Escape, but at what cost? She glanced back toward Timmy, her brother standing motionless, his eyes vacant. He was nothing more than a hollow version of the boy she had once known, trapped in the fairy's thrall. His laughter still echoed in her ears, a cruel mockery of his playful nature. He was lost. Forever. Her thoughts were muddled, panic clawing at her mind, but then the realization hit her like a wave crashing over rocks. The fairy wasn't just offering her an escape, it was giving her a choice, a terrible, unbearable choice. She could leave. She could break free from the forest, from the trap the fairy had set for her. But in exchange, she would have to leave something behind. The forest demanded a sacrifice. The sacrifice was not a simple one. It was not the land, nor the trees, nor even the magic that ran through the roots beneath her feet. No. The fairy wanted something far more precious. It wanted a soul. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could leave, yes. But to do so, she would have to give up the only thing that mattered, Timmy. His soul would remain in the woods, bound to the fairy's will, lost forever to the darkness. She stumbled back, feeling the air grow heavier, the whispers of the forest growing louder in her ears. "Choose," the fairy said, its voice dripping with dark amusement. "The boy's soul, or your own." Emma's eyes darted from Timmy to the path ahead, where the distant light of freedom flickered like a fragile candle in the storm. The fairy's form shimmered, glowing brighter and brighter, its twisted wings flickering like the last remnants of a dying flame. She knew the forest would not let her go without taking something in return. But could she really make such a choice? Her mind screamed, no! Her brother was still in there, still alive, if she could just find a way to save him, to break the fairy's hold. But the longer she hesitated, the more the fairy seemed to close in, its grip tightening around her, suffocating her with the weight of its power. The woods claim what they desire, the fairy murmured, and they never let go. Not unless you give them what they want. It's not just your freedom you must barter for. Emma's hands trembled as she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Timmy. The hollow expression in his eyes was the only answer she needed. He was lost. She couldn't save him, not without making a sacrifice. The forest had already taken him, and now it wanted her to pay the price. Timmy. I'm so sorry, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. I can't leave you behind. Not like this. But the words felt hollow, like they were never meant to be said. She could feel the forest shifting, its whispers now louder than ever, as though the woods themselves were urging her to make a decision. There was no time left. No more moments to waste. The forest was pulling at her, its very being calling for her to surrender. Her legs felt weak, her mind clouded with the impossible choice she had to make. What if I don't choose? She asked, barely able to speak the words, her voice desperate. Then you will be consumed, the fairy answered, its smile widening, full of cruel satisfaction. The forest does not allow indecision. You must give something. Only then will you be free. Emma's eyes went back to Timmy. His eyes were still locked on the fairy, still lost. The fairy had claimed him. But she still had a chance. She could walk away, but it would cost her everything. She took a deep breath, her body trembling with the weight of the choice. There was only one way to leave the forest alive. One way to break free from the fairy's grasp. And with a heart heavy with grief, Emma stepped forward, her eyes never leaving her brother's vacant gaze. The forest was quiet for a moment, as if holding its breath. Then, with a final, painful choice, Emma spoke. Take me, she whispered. Take me instead. The fairy's laughter filled the air, deafening, as its wings spread wide, the light of its globe blinding Emma's vision. It had won. But Emma had given her everything. And in that moment, she was consumed by the forest, her soul claimed by the fairy. Timmy, still in the distance, stood motionless, watching the sacrifice unfold. The fairy's grip was unyielding, and as Emma's form dissolved into the darkness, she was lost to the woods forever. The forest had claimed another soul, and the price for survival had been paid. The air in the woods grew heavier, suffocating Emma with the weight of the choice she had to make. The forest pressed in on her, the twisted trees leaning closer as though they were waiting for her to choose. The whispers that filled her ears were no longer faint and far off, but sharp, frantic, like 1,000 voices begging for release. The fairy, its glowing form flickering like the last, desperate breath of a dying fire, hovered just in front of her. It waited, its presence an oppressive shadow that enveloped her completely. Emma's heart raced, her mind spinning as the forest seemed to close in on her from all sides. She had tried to save him. She had fought with every ounce of her being to protect Timmy. But the fairy's hold was too strong. The moment she had feared, the moment she had hoped would never come, had arrived. Timmy stood motionless in front of her, his vacant eyes locked onto the fairy's glowing form. He wasn't her brother anymore. The Timmy she knew, the curious, lively boy with a laugh that echoed in the fields, was gone. His soul had been claimed, twisted by the fairy's dark magic, and he had become nothing more than a puppet in its grasp. "Timmy," Emma whispered, her voice barely a breath, choked with sorrow. She reached for him, her hands trembling as she took a hesitant step forward. But her brother didn't move. His eyes remained empty, the light of his soul long since drained by the fairy's influence. And then she heard it. The whisper from the fairy, dark and insidious. "It's too late for him." The words cut through Emma like a knife, their cruelty ringing in her ears. But there was truth in them. The boy she had known was lost forever. The fairy spoke again, its voice almost tender now, as if it were coaxing Emma into accepting the reality of the situation. "You can't save him. Not anymore. He is mine, as all of them are. And if you want to escape, you will have to make a choice." Emma's breath hitched as the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a response. Her thoughts spun. She wanted to scream, to break free, to fight. But the path was clear, and the fairy had laid it before her, like a cruel game with no rules. She could leave. She could escape the forest and live to see another day. But to do so, she would have to make a sacrifice. The price for freedom was always the same. Her eyes drifted back to Timmy, her heart breaking with the weight of the decision. The boy who had followed her into the woods. The boy she had promised to protect. But the promise had been broken. The woods had taken him long before Emma had realized the truth. A wave of grief washed over her, but she pushed it down, steeling herself against the pain. She was his protector. She always had been. And if there was a way to save him, it was no longer by holding onto him. She couldn't drag him back. Not now. With a heavy heart, Emma made her choice. "Take him instead," she whispered, her voice breaking with sorrow. "Take Timmy, and let me go." The fairy's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, its smile widening like the darkness of the night. It was exactly what it had been waiting for. The sacrifice, the severing of the bond between siblings, the breaking of the last tether to the world beyond the woods. The forest seemed to grow still as the fairy extended its wings, glowing with an eerie light. It hovered for a moment, its form flickering like the faintest stars in the sky. Then, with a cruel flash, it reached out, enveloping Timmy in a burst of light so bright that Emma had to shield her eyes. Timmy didn't scream. He didn't struggle. He simply faded. His form dissolved into the light, his soul swallowed by the very forest that had claimed him, his body nothing more than a shadow of what it once was. For a moment, there was silence. And then, Emma felt it. The chains that had bound her to the woods seemed to loosen. The air grew lighter, the trees less oppressive. The whispers faded into the distance. She was free. She stumbled backward, her knees buckling under the weight of what she had done. Tears blurred her vision as she looked once more toward the spot where her brother had been. Timmy was gone, but she was alive. The fairy, its twisted smile still etched across its face, turned away. It had claimed another soul, another victim. It was satisfied. For now. Emma stood in the clearing, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief. She had made the impossible choice, the cruel sacrifice, and now she was free. But at what cost? She had lost her brother forever, and the woods would never let her forget it. With the last of her strength, she turned and began to stumble away from the heart of the forest. The path ahead was unclear, But one thing was certain, she had escaped. And the forest had claimed its price. Emma stumbled through the woods, her legs shaking with the weight of the past moments. The forest seemed to stretch and twist behind her, as if it were trying to pull her back into its suffocating embrace. But she kept moving, driven by the one thing left to her, survival. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally began to thin, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the canopy, guiding her toward the edge of the forest. She emerged into the open field, the familiar sight of the farm greeting her eyes. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the wide expanse of land that had once been so full of life. The sound of the wind in the tall grass, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, all the sounds of a peaceful evening were there. Yet, something was wrong. The air felt too still, too quiet. The world around her seemed distant, as if it was somehow not quite real. Emma blinked, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. She looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the twisted trees reaching out for her, but the woods stood still, their dark heart hidden beyond the horizon. She had made it out. She had survived. But at what cost? The farm seemed unchanged, the old barn and the house standing solid as they always had. Yet, there was no sound of her parents calling from inside, no hum of life in the air. No sign of Timmy. Emma's chest tightened. She walked slowly toward the house, her feet heavy with the knowledge of what she had left behind. The door was slightly ajar, a faint creak in the wind pushing it open just enough for her to slip inside. The house was silent. She called out, but the sound of her voice felt foreign in her own ears, swallowed by the emptiness around her. No response. The rooms, once so full of warmth and laughter, were now eerily still. The light filtering through the dusty windows seemed muted, the colors of the walls and furniture faded, as though the house itself were grieving. She moved through the rooms, each step heavier than the last. The kitchen, where she had once cooked with her mother, felt abandoned, its counters covered in dust. The dining room table, where the family used to sit together every evening, stood bare. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached Timmy's room. The door was cracked open, just as she had left it. But when she pushed it fully open, she found it empty. His toys, his books, his things, all were gone. The bed was made, untouched, as though he had never been there. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine. She wanted to scream, to call out for him, but the words wouldn't come. The house felt so hollow, so wrong. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the middle of the room, her hands shaking as she covered her face. She had come back, but everything had changed. The world outside the woods no longer felt like her world. The memories of laughter, of life, everything that once defined this place, now seemed distant, as though it belonged to someone else. The air around her grew heavy, pressing down on her, suffocating her as the whispers from the woods, faint but unmistakable, started to creep into her mind once again. Emma's breath caught in her throat. They were back. The voices. The children's voices. They whispered her name, soft at first, then louder, their voices rising from the shadows, calling to her from all around. Emma. She looked around frantically, but no one was there. The room was empty, yet the voices seemed to echo from every corner, growing louder, insistent. Emma, come back. The words chilled her to the bone. She stood up, her head spinning, her thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. Was she still in the woods? Was she still trapped in that dark place, her mind conjuring these horrors as a punishment for what she had done? Her heart raced. She could still hear them, those lost children, calling her name. The reality around her was slipping away, bending and warping as if the very fabric of the world had been torn apart by the fairy's power. She stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the sounds, desperate to escape the feeling that the house itself was closing in on her. As she stepped outside, she was hit with a gust of cold wind, the golden light of the setting sun now dim and muted. The world felt empty, hollow. Everything was wrong. Emma turned to look back at the house, but the familiar shapes seemed to shift before her eyes. The barn now looked dilapidated, the trees surrounding the farm dark and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The entire landscape had changed. It no longer looked like the place she had known her whole life. The whispers continued to grow louder, surrounding her, pulling her in. Come back. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but the voices wouldn't stop. She could still hear Timmy's laughter in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The forest had taken him, and now it was taking her, piece by piece. Emma collapsed to her knees in the middle of the field, tears streaming down her face as she realized the truth. She had survived, yes. But in doing so, she had lost more than she could ever regain. The fairy's influence had not been confined to the woods, it had seeped into her world, twisting reality itself, leaving nothing but an echo of what had once been. The price of survival had been too high. And now, there was no way back. The woods had claimed their due, and Emma was left, a ghost in a world that no longer recognized her. The whispers, now a constant hum in her mind, promised that the forest would always be with her. Always. Her brother, her family, none of them would ever return. She was alone, lost in a world that had never felt more empty. The wind picked up, the field now filled with a deep, unnatural chill as Emma sat in the center of the farm, her body trembling with the weight of what she had done. The sounds of the forest, once distant, now surged around her, wrapping around her mind like a thick fog. The whispers were relentless, filling her head with the faint, haunting calls of children, the same calls that had echoed through the trees. Emma. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands to her ears in a vain attempt to block them out. Emma, come back. Timmy's voice. Her heart raced in her chest, the ache of his absence gnawing at her soul. She could almost feel his tiny hands, the weight of his presence beside her. And yet, it wasn't him. Not really. Not anymore. His voice was just another echo from the past, a whisper carried by the very force that had claimed him. The trees that surrounded the farm seemed to stretch and twist, their dark, gnarled limbs reaching for her. In the distance, the edge of the woods beckoned, the path to its shroud in shadows. It was as though the forest was alive, calling her back. She could hear the rustling of the leaves, like the soft, coaxing hum of the fairy's song, urging her to return to the place where the dark magic had first taken hold. Emma. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was so clear, so close now, as if Timmy himself were standing right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. She was alone. And yet, she wasn't. The figure of the fairy, flickering in the corner of her mind, was never far. She could almost see its glowing form, distorted and flickering like a dying light, always watching her. It was there in the whispers. It was there in the voices of the children, trapped forever in the woods. Timmy, she whispered, her voice breaking. She could hear him now, his laughter echoing from deep within the forest. But it wasn't the joyful laughter of her little brother. No. It was hollow, empty, twisted by the dark force that controlled him. Emma, come back. Her chest tightened as the weight of the truth hit her. Timmy was gone. All of them were gone. Lost to the woods, lost to the fairies' insidious power. And she had been left behind, marked forever by the price of survival. With every whisper, she felt herself slipping, her grip on reality weakening. She wanted to scream, to fight against the pull, but she knew it was futile. She could feel the fairy's presence like a shadow, hovering just beyond her vision, waiting for her to make her final choice. It was never over. The fairy's power had seeped into her world, and there was no escaping it. She had thought that leaving the forest would save her, that she could return to her old life. But she had been wrong. She was never truly free. The fairy would always be with her, its dark influence never far. And now, as the voices swirled around her, Timmy's voice among them, she understood. Her brother wasn't lost. He had become part of it. Part of the fairy's endless army of children, trapped in the woods forever. Emma's body shook with silent sobs, her mind unraveling, the weight of her decision crashing down upon her. She could hear the whispers more clearly now, all around her, calling her name, soft at first, like the flutter of a distant breeze, but then growing louder, more insistent. Emma, Emma, come back. Her mind teetered on the edge of madness, the voices crashing through her thoughts, warping reality until she could no longer tell where the forest ended and where her world began. The farm, the house, the familiar fields, they were fading, slipping through her fingers like sand. The boundaries of reality were blurring, and Emma could no longer tell if she was standing in her own world or if the forest had claimed her entirely. Emma. Timmy's voice, once a source of warmth and joy, now sounded like a death knell. A reminder that she could never truly escape. Not really. The fairy had won. And now, so had the forest. Emma, lost in the whispers of the children, was trapped forever, her soul a part of the woods she had once known. There would be no return. The world outside the forest was a hollow shell, a distant memory, and the woods had claimed its due. Emma's fate was sealed. The fairy's power was eternal, and she would never be free. She heard the voices again. Louder now. So loud she could no longer distinguish where her thoughts ended and the whispers began. And as the wind carried the faint laughter of children, Emma realized with horrifying clarity that the forest was not just a place. It was a part of her now. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.